Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. Okay, I'll try to write this. I've never really talked about it in detail online before, but I've been reading this forum for a while, and I guess it's time. I need to get it out, and maybe typing it will make it feel a little less heavy, though I doubt it. This happened to me on the evening of May 23rd, 2007. I remember the date because it was my husband's birthday, and that's why I was even out that late. I was driving home from Cloverdale, Indiana. We lived just outside of town, off Jackie Dunn Hill Road. It's a road I'd driven 1,000 times, probably more. It's one of those country roads that's paved but feels like it isn't, all cracked and patched up, winding through thick woods on both sides. There are no streetlights. Once you're past the last house on the edge of town, it's just you and your headlights until you get to our place. It was my usual route, always. I knew every curve, every pothole to avoid, every driveway that was mostly hidden by overgrowth. That night, I'd gone into town to get cigarettes for my husband. He'd run out, and it was his birthday, so I didn't mind making the trip. It was just getting dark, that deep, gloomy twilight where the sky is still kind of blue, but everything on the ground is sinking into shadows. I remember the air was cool for late May, and I had my window cracked open just a bit, enough to feel the breeze and smell the damp, earthy scent of the woods. I was driving slow, not in any hurry. The radio was playing some old country station, low, just background noise. I was just thinking about getting home, maybe having a piece of the cake I'd baked. Just a normal evening. I came around this one bend, a left-hand curve that's sharper than it looks. My headlights swept across the road and the ditch on the left side, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a tree, a blackened dead tree stump or something. We'd had some storms the week before, and sometimes old trees would fall over or get scorched by lightning. It was just this tall, dark shape, standing maybe 15-20 feet off the shoulder, right at the tree line. It didn't register as anything strange. My brain just filed it away as tree, and I was about to look back at the road, but then it moved. It wasn't a big movement. It was just a slight shift, like it adjusted its weight, but it was enough. My eyes snapped back to it. My foot lifted off the gas without me even thinking. The car started to slow. I remember my heart did this little stutter, like when you miss a step on the stairs. I thought, what was that? Maybe a deer, but it was too upright, too still now. I kept driving, but slower, my eyes glued to this shape. It was just standing there facing the road. As I got closer, the details started to come into focus in my headlights, and that's when the first real trickle of fear went down my spine. It was tall, really tall. Way taller than a man, and it was covered, and I mean completely covered in this black hair. It looked like thick, shaggy fur, but it was so dark, it almost absorbed the light. It was just a solid, black, man-shaped silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the woods. My mind was racing, trying to find an explanation. A bear! Indiana doesn't have bears like that. Not around here, and bears don't stand on two legs like that. Not so perfectly upright and still. This thing was standing like a person. Its arms were long, hanging down by its sides. I couldn't see its feet because of the tall grass and weeds in the ditch. I was maybe 50 feet away now, crawling along at maybe 10 miles an hour. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I could hear my own breathing loud in the quiet of the car. The radio was still playing some twangy song, and it felt so wrong, so disconnected from what I was seeing. I remember a specific, stupid detail. The song was "He Stopped Loving Her Today" by George Jones. I'll never hear that song again without feeling cold. Then it turned. It didn't move its body, and then its head. It just turned its whole upper body towards me, smooth and fast. It was now directly facing my car, and my headlights hit it full on. Time didn't just slow down, it froze. It absolutely stopped. For what felt like a full minute, but was probably only 2 or 3 seconds, the entire world ceased to exist. There was no sound, no feeling of the car seat under me, no cool breeze from the window. There was just this thing and me. The headlights illuminated it perfectly. The hair was long and matted, looked almost wet in places. It was built massive through the chest and shoulders, like a powerlifter but on a gigantic scale. And its face. Oh God, its face. It wasn't an animal's face. It wasn't a bear's snout or a deer's long nose. It was flatter. It had a prominent brow ridge. And underneath that, in the shadows, I could see 2 eyes. They weren't glowing red or anything you see in the movies. They were just dark, but they were intelligent. They were looking right at me, not at the car. At me. Through the windshield, I felt its gaze like a physical pressure on my skin. Its face was darker than the rest of it, a blackish, leathery skin. And it didn't have much hair on it, just around the edges. This wasn't a curious animal. This wasn't a lost bear. This was something else. Something that knew what a car was. Something that knew I was inside it. That moment of recognition, that split second where my brain finally, irrefutably accepted that this was no ordinary creature. It was like a bucket of ice water got dumped directly into my soul. A pure, undiluted dread filled me up from my toes to the top of my head. It was a feeling of being in the presence of something that shouldn't be, something that defied every rule of the world I knew. My stomach twisted into a hard knot. I felt lightheaded, like I might pass out. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. I was just locked in place, staring back at this giant, hairy thing that was staring at me. We faced each other in that frozen silence. Its expression was, it's hard to describe. It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was just aware, deeply, profoundly aware. And its size, now that I could see it properly, was terrifying. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It made the saplings behind it look like twigs. Then it was over. It turned its head, looked away from me, back towards the woods, and then it moved. It didn't run. It didn't crash through the underbrush. It took 2 steps, 2 long steps. I've never seen anything move like that. It was fluid and powerful, like its legs were springs. Each step covered an impossible amount of ground. 1 step from the ditch into the first line of trees, and the second step took it so deep into the woods that it was just gone. It vanished. Instantly. 1 second it was there, a massive, impossible figure in my headlights, and the next second, there was nothing. Just the empty space where it had been, and the dark, silent woods. The spell broke. I gasped, sucking in a ragged breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. I stomped on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, the engine roaring. I didn't look back, I couldn't. I just drove. My eyes glued to the road in front of me, my whole body shaking so badly I could barely keep the car in my lane. The rest of the drive home is a blur. I remember the feeling of the steering wheel, slick with my sweat. I remember the yellow lines of the road flashing by. I remember finally seeing the porch light of our house and feeling a wave of relief so strong it made me nauseous. I skidded into the driveway, threw the car in park and ran inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. My husband was in the living room. He took one look at my face and stood up. "What's wrong? You're white as a sheet." I couldn't speak at first. I just stood there, trembling, leaning against the door. I finally managed to stammer it out, the words tumbling over each other. "I saw something on Jackie Dunn Hill in the woods." He thought it was a deer or maybe a person messing around, but when I described it, the height, the hair, the face, the way it moved, he got quiet. He's a practical man, a mechanic. He doesn't believe in ghosts or aliens or any of that, but he knows me. He knows I don't spook easy. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, that dark face looking right at me. I kept the bedroom light on. The thing that really gets me, the part that changed everything for me, is the before and after. Before that night, I was comfortable in the woods. I grew up around them. I hunted for morel mushrooms every spring. I'd go out with my .22 and hunt squirrels. I'd walk for hours by myself, just enjoying the quiet, the smell of the leaves, the sound of the birds. I never felt scared. It was my sanctuary. After that night, that was all gone. I tried to go back a few weeks later. I thought maybe I'd been tired, maybe I'd imagined it. I got my mushroom basket and my walking stick and I drove to my usual spot. I got out of the car, took 2 steps towards the tree line, and this wave of pure animal panic hit me. My heart started racing, my palms got sweaty, and I couldn't make my legs go any further. It was like an invisible wall was there. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt watched. They felt occupied. I got back in my car and I haven't set foot in any wooded area alone since, not once. It's been years. I used to have a kind of casual, curious belief in Bigfoot. You know, like, yeah, maybe, in the vast wilderness, it's possible. It was an abstract idea, a fun thing to think about. That sighting erased all doubt. It wasn't fun, it wasn't abstract, it was real, and it was terrifying. I know what I saw, I know it was there. It permanently altered my view of the outdoors. I don't see beauty when I look at a forest now. I see a hiding place. I feel a lingering unease that never really goes away. It's like I was let in on a secret, a dark one, that the world isn't as mapped or as safe as we think it is, that there are things living in the shadows of our own backyards that we can't explain, and that one wrong turn on a country road on a May evening can show you something that will haunt you for the rest of your life. And sometimes, when I'm driving home late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of a dark shape between the trees out of the corner of my eye, and my heart will jump into my throat, and for a split second I'm right back there, frozen in my car, staring into those dark, knowing eyes. I guess a part of me always will be. I just keep driving. I never stop. I never look back. Story 2. All right, so I've been sitting on this for a while, but I need to get it out. I've never posted anything like this before, but after what happened, I can't keep it bottled up anymore. This was in the Citrus Wildlife Management area in Florida, back when I was really into bow hunting. I'd been going there for years, knew the place like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. But this one morning, man, it changed everything. It was early fall, I think around October, and the air was starting to get that slight chill in the mornings, which in Florida means it's not boiling hot yet. I'd woken up at like 3 in the morning, grabbed my gear and headed out. I remember driving through those dark, empty roads, nothing but the hum of my truck and the occasional pair of eyes reflecting back from the ditches. I liked getting there early, an hour before daylight, to set up and get settled before the animals started moving. It was my routine, something I did almost every weekend during hunting season. When I pulled into the usual spot, it was still pitch black. I mean, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, kind of dark. I killed the engine, and that silence just wrapped around me, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat. I sat there for a minute, letting my eyes adjust. Then I grabbed my bow and backpack and opened the door. The cool air hit me, and I remember taking a deep breath, feeling that familiar mix of excitement and calm. I'd done this so many times, it was almost automatic. I stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel, and I was about to lock the truck when I heard it. Behind me, from the bushes, maybe 20 feet away, there was this loud, sudden crash, like something big had just leaped out and landed hard. It wasn't a rustle or a snap. It was a full-on thud, like a body hitting the ground. I froze right there, my hand still on the door handle. My heart just slammed into my throat, and for a second, I couldn't even breathe. I'm not easily spooked. I've been hunting since I was a kid, spent countless nights in the woods. But this was different. This felt intentional. Then the smell hit me. Oh God, the smell. It was this overwhelming stench of shit, like raw sewage or something rotting, so strong it made me gag. I actually had to cover my nose with my sleeve because it was so potent. But here's the weird part. It didn't linger. It was there for maybe 5 seconds, tops, and then it was gone, like it never happened. The air went back to normal, just that damp, earthy forest smell. But that brief whiff was enough to make my stomach turn. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like forever. My mind was racing. Was it a bear? A hog? But I've been around bears, and their smell isn't like that. This was foul, like something had died and been left to decay, and the sound, whatever it was big. I could feel the vibration in the ground, a slight tremor under my feet. I finally forced myself to move, fumbling for my flashlight in my backpack. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I clicked it on, and the beam cut through the darkness, swinging toward where the noise came from. I scanned the area back and forth, but there was nothing. No eyes glowing back, no movement, just thick bushes and shadows that seemed to shift every time I moved the light. I kept expecting to see something, a pair of eyes, a shape, but it was empty. The silence was back, but now it felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. I remember my skin was crawling, that prickly feeling you get when you know you're being watched. I stood there for a good 10 minutes, flashlight beam trembling in my hand, but nothing moved. No more sounds, no smell, just me and the dark. Eventually, I made myself walk toward the spot, my bow held tight in my other hand. I'm not sure what I thought I'd find. Tracks, maybe, or broken branches. But when I got there, the ground was just matted leaves and dirt. No prints, no nothing. It was like whatever it was had vanished into thin air. I felt stupid standing there in the dark, but that fear was real. My heart was still pounding, and I had this cold sweat on my back despite the cool air. I decided to just head to my stand like I planned. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself, a deer spooked or a hog bolting. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Deer don't smell like that, and hogs don't move that quietly after making a noise like that. I trudged through the woods, my flashlight beam bouncing ahead of me, and every little sound, a leaf rustling, a twig snapping, made me jump. I've never been so on edge in my life. Usually the woods are my sanctuary, but that morning they felt alien, hostile almost. I reached my tree stand and climbed up, settling in. The stand was about 15 feet up, overlooking a game trail I'd scouted before. As I sat there, waiting for daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. The darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive. I kept my flashlight pointed down, but I'd glance around every few seconds, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows. Time dragged on, and the sky started to lighten slowly, from black to deep blue, then grey. With the dawn came the sounds of the forest waking up, birds chirping, squirrels chattering, but it didn't comfort me. If anything, it made me more anxious, because whatever had been there was gone now, hidden by the daylight. As the sun rose, I heard other vehicles pulling into the area, hunters arriving, doors slamming, voices carrying through the trees. Normally, I'd feel relieved, but that day, it just made me feel isolated. I climbed down from my stand and walked back to where I'd parked, thinking maybe I'd see some evidence in the light. But when I got there, the ground was trampled with tire tracks and footprints from the other guys. Any sign of what happened was wiped out completely. I knelt down, looking at the spot where I'd heard the noise, but it was just packed dirt and gravel now. Nothing to show for it. I spent the rest of the morning in my stand, but I couldn't focus. Every time I heard a branch crack, my head would snap toward it. I didn't see any game, didn't even draw my bow. I just sat there, replaying that moment over and over in my head. The sound, the smell, the way I froze. By midday, I packed up and left. I didn't tell any of the other hunters what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, but driving home, my hands were still shaky on the wheel, and that smell seemed stuck in my nose, like it had burned itself into my memory. That was the first time, and it left me deeply unnerved. I've had other encounters since then, heard calls I couldn't identify, saw something massive cross the road once. But that initial moment, standing there in the dark, with that stench filling the air, that's what stuck with me. To this day, I can't explain what it was. It wasn't any animal I've ever come across, and I've spent my life in these woods. Whatever it was, it felt ancient, powerful, and it knew I was there. I still go hunting sometimes, but I'm always on edge, always listening for that sound, smelling for that odor. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I'll freeze for no reason, remembering that morning when something jumped out of the bushes and left me terrified, unable to move, with nothing but the memory of that awful smell and the certainty that I wasn't alone. Story 3. It was the kind of cold that gets into your bones and sets up shop the middle of January. Must have been around 2 or 3 in the morning. I'd been dead asleep, the good kind of sleep you only get when the world is frozen solid and silent outside. Then something woke me up. It wasn't a sound you could ignore, not a branch scraping the roof or the house settling. This was a heavy, rhythmic thump, 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 like someone was dropping sacks of wet sand onto the frozen ground right outside my bedroom window. My cabin's on Route 4, a good ways outside of Sullivan. It's not totally isolated, but my nearest neighbor is far enough away that you can't see their lights. It's just me, my 2 bird dogs, and a whole lot of woods. The dogs usually, they'd be raising hell at any little noise, but they were quiet. Eerily quiet. That was the first thing that really set my nerves on edge. I could feel the silence from their corner of the room, a tense, waiting kind of silence. I lay there for a minute, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs, trying to convince myself it was a dream, or a deer, or maybe a bear. We get black bears around here, but they're usually skittish. This thumping was deliberate, solid, and underneath it I could hear this other sound, a low, deep, rumbling breath. It wasn't a pant. It was like the sound a big engine makes idling, a hoo, hoo, that vibrated right through the walls. My bedroom window faces the side yard, where I've got an old oak tree and a pile of firewood I hadn't gotten around to splitting yet. The moon was just a sliver, not much light, but there was enough of a glow from the snow on the ground to see shapes. I slid out of bed, the floorboards icy under my bare feet, and crept to the window. I didn't turn on a light. I just slowly, so slowly, peeled back the corner of the curtain and looked out. My breath caught in my throat. 20 feet away, just standing there between the oak tree and my woodpile, was this thing. It was huge. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing had to be at least a foot taller, maybe more. 7 feet, easy. It was just standing there broadside to me, and it was covered head to toe in this matted, shaggy brown hair. It looked heavy, like a wet fur coat. Its shoulders were massive, just slabs of muscle, and it had no neck to speak of. Its head seemed to sit right on top of those shoulders. The thumping had stopped, and it was just scanning the yard. Its head moved slowly, calmly, like it was looking for something. Then it turned its head just a little, and I saw its eyes. They reflected a dull, reddish glow, not like a deer's eyes, which shine bright white or green. This was a deep, dark red, like old embers in a dying fire. There was no life in them, no curiosity, no fear, just this flat, ancient sort of observation. My blood went cold, colder than the floor under my feet. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't anything I'd ever seen or heard of. The panic hit me then, a pure animal fear that shut down every thought in my head except one, my gun. I have a .22 caliber pistol I keep in the nightstand for varmints. It's not a powerful gun, but it's loud, and in that moment, noise was what I wanted. I needed to scare it off. I fumbled for the drawer, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get it open. I grabbed the pistol, the metal cold and familiar in my hand. I didn't even think. I didn't put on shoes or a coat. I just walked straight to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air hit me like a physical blow, but I barely felt it. The creature was still there, maybe 30 feet away now, having turned slightly to face the woods. It hadn't noticed me yet. I could see its breath pluming in the air, great big clouds of steam that hung in the stillness. That deep, rumbling breathing was louder out here, a sound you could feel in your chest. I raised the pistol, holding it with both hands to try and steady my shaking. I didn't aim. I just pointed it in its general direction and started pulling the trigger. The crack of the .22 was incredibly loud in the silent night. Pop, pop, pop. I emptied the whole magazine, all 9 rounds, right into its chest and side. What happened next is burned into my mind. The creature flinched. That's it. It wasn't a cry of pain, it wasn't a stagger. It was just a quick, full-body twitch like a horse shaking off a fly. Then it stopped, and it turned its head. Those dull red eyes locked onto me. There was no surprise in them, no anger. It was the calmest, most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. It just looked at me. I was standing there on my porch in my underwear, barefoot in the snow, holding an empty pistol, and this thing was just looking at me. I could see the dark spots on its fur where the bullets had hit. No blood, no reaction, nothing. Time seemed to stop. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stared back, trapped in that red gaze. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned its whole body to face the woods. It took a step, then another. Its walk was heavy, its long arms swinging slightly at its sides. It wasn't running, it wasn't even hurrying. It was just walking away, like it had all the time in the world, and I was just a minor inconvenience. A rage boiled up in me then, hot and sudden, cutting through the fear. This thing, this monster, was on my property, and it had just ignored me. It had ignored 9 bullets. It wasn't scared of me. That thought, more than its size or its eyes, filled me with a blind, furious terror. I wasn't going to let it just walk away. I dropped the pistol on the porch with a clatter and ran back inside, my feet numb from the cold. I keep my big gun, a .45-70 government lever-action rifle, propped in the corner by the door. It's a cannon. It can drop a moose. I grabbed it, my fingers fumbling with the lever to make sure a round was chambered. I didn't stop to think about what I was doing. I just ran back out onto the porch. The creature was almost at the tree line, a dark, hulking shape about 50 yards away now, just about to be swallowed by the shadows of the pines. I raised the rifle, the stock cold against my cheek. I didn't have a clear shot at its center mass anymore, so I aimed for its shoulder, that massive mound of muscle. I took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The boom of the .45-70 was deafening. It echoed through the hollow, a sound that usually brings a sense of finality. I saw the impact. I saw its fur and flesh jerk from the hit. The creature stumbled, just a half step, its left shoulder dipping. It stopped walking. My heart was pounding. This was it. This would bring it down. It turned its head again, looking back over its shoulder at me. Even from that distance, I could see those 2 red pinpricks. It didn't make a sound. It didn't snarl or roar. It just looked at me for a long, long second. Then it turned back towards the woods, and it simply vanished. It didn't run. It just took one more step and was gone, absorbed into the blackness between the trees. I stood there on the porch, the rifle still raised, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. The silence rushed back in, heavier and more profound than before. I was trembling all over, from the cold and from the shock. I lowered the rifle and just stared at the spot where it had disappeared. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. A .22 is one thing, but a .45-70, that's a bullet that can punch through an engine block, and it had just shrugged it off. It had stumbled, but it hadn't fallen. It hadn't even cried out. I don't know how long I stood there. Eventually, the cold became unbearable, and I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I sat at my kitchen table with the rifle across my lap, staring at the door, waiting for it to come back. I called the police. My voice was a shaky mess when I tried to explain what happened. I just said there was a large, aggressive animal on my property, and I'd shot at it. The sheriff and a deputy showed up maybe 45 minutes later. By then, the first grey light of dawn was creeping into the sky. I was still in my underwear, wrapped in a blanket, but I'd stopped shivering. I was just numb. I led them outside and showed them where it had been standing. The ground was frozen solid, so there were no clear footprints, just some indistinct depressions in the icy crust. We walked over to the tree line. Nothing. I told them I'd hit it multiple times with a .22 and then with the big rifle. The sheriff, an older guy I've known for years, looked at me with a kind of tired skepticism. They spent the next couple of hours searching the area. They combed through the woods with flashlights, following the direction it had gone. They were looking for blood, for fur, for any sign at all. They found nothing, not a single drop of blood, not a tuft of hair, nothing. It was as if I had shot at a ghost. The sun was fully up by the time they left, telling me to call if I saw anything else. I knew from the look on their faces that they didn't really believe me. They probably thought I'd had a bad dream, or maybe had one too many drinks. But the rumors started a day or two later. Someone at the diner in town mentioned Momo, Missouri's monster, the Missouri Momo. I'd heard the stories before, campfire tales about a big hairy ape man in the woods. I'd never paid them any mind. I'm a practical man. I hunt, I know the woods, I know what's in them, or I thought I did. The thing that haunts me, the thing that keeps me up at night, isn't its size or its strength. It was its calm, the absolute unnerving calm. When it turned and looked at me after I'd emptied a pistol into its chest, there was no aggression. It was just awareness. It looked at me the way a man might look at a gnat buzzing around his head. An annoyance, not a threat. I don't go into the woods anymore. I used to love to hunt. I'd be out there at first light every weekend during the season. My rifle sits in the corner, and I haven't touched it since that night. The woods don't feel the same. They feel occupied, watched. My dogs won't go near the tree line anymore. They used to love to run and explore. Now if I let them out, they'll do their business in the yard and then stand at the door, whining to be let back in. They won't even look towards the woods. They sense it. They know something is out there. Sometimes late at night I'll wake up and think I hear that heavy thumping sound again. I'll lie there perfectly still, my heart pounding, listening. It's usually just the house or the wind, but I can never get back to sleep. I just lie there and stare at the ceiling, seeing those two dull red eyes in the darkness, feeling that same cold terror. I fired 10 rounds at it, 10, and it just walked away. What kind of thing can do that? I don't know. I don't think I ever want to know. I just know it was there, and it was real, and it's still out there somewhere. Story 4. So, a few years back, I was 34 years old and decided to do a solo backpacking trip in Montana's Beartooth Mountains. I'd been there before with friends, but this time I wanted to test myself, see if I could handle being alone in the wild for a week. I'm not some hardcore survivalist, just a guy who likes hiking and camping, but I thought I knew what I was doing. The West Rosebud Trail was supposed to be challenging but manageable, with amazing views and plenty of spots to camp. I'd packed light, tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, and enough food for 7 days. Nothing fancy. The first day was fine. I hiked in, set up camp near a creek, and spent the evening just listening to the water and the wind. It was peaceful. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be out there, away from all the noise and stress of everyday life. I slept okay that night, though I did wake up a couple of times to noises, probably just animals rustling around, nothing unusual. The second day, I woke up early, made some coffee, and spent the morning hiking deeper into the mountains. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with a cool breeze. I found a new campsite around midday, this time on a ridge with a view of the valley below. It felt isolated, but in a good way. I set up my tent, gathered some dry wood for a fire later, and just relaxed for a bit. I remember feeling proud of myself for handling everything solo. That feeling didn't last long. As evening approached, I realized I needed more firewood to last through the night. The sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows, and the temperature was dropping fast. I grabbed my small hatchet and headed into the trees behind my camp. The forest was thick there, with tall pines and lots of underbrush. I spent maybe 20-30 minutes gathering sticks and logs, filling my arms until I couldn't carry any more. It was quiet, too quiet, now that I think back on it. No birds chirping, no squirrels chattering, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the ground. When I turned to head back to camp, my arms full of wood, that's when everything started to go wrong. I remember stumbling a little on a root, and as I looked up toward my campsite, I froze. My tent wasn't where I'd left it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me in the fading light. But no. My tent was hanging from a tree branch, maybe 10 feet off the ground. It was draped over the limb, like some kind of weird flag, all twisted and torn. The poles were snapped, and the fabric was flapping in the wind. I dropped the firewood. It clattered to the ground, but I barely heard it. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. I took a few steps closer, and that's when I saw my backpack. It was lying on the ground near where the tent should have been, but it was ripped open, like something had clawed through it. All my food was gone, the packets of dehydrated meals, the energy bars, everything. Scattered around were empty wrappers and torn plastic, but no sign of whatever did it. My first thought was a bear. I'd seen bear warnings in the area, and I'd hung my food properly the night before. But this didn't look like a bear. Bears don't throw tents into trees. They might shred a backpack for food, but this was different. The tent was too high up, and it was placed there almost deliberately. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I started scanning the trees around me, my eyes darting everywhere. That's when I got the feeling I was being watched. It wasn't just a vague sense. It was intense, like someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was a prank, I thought, but who would be out here? I hadn't seen another person all day. Then I heard it, a giggle. It was soft at first, like a child's laugh, but distorted, like it was coming through a broken speaker. It sent a shiver down my spine. I stood completely still, listening. The giggle came again, this time closer, and it was followed by a voice. It was low and raspy, almost synthetic, and it said, "From me." Then another giggle, and "me." The words were clear but wrong, like they were being forced out of something that wasn't meant to speak. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. My mouth went dry. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. I kept looking around, and that's when I saw movement on the ridge across from me. There was a figure, tall and muscular, covered in dark hair or fur, I couldn't tell. It was standing on a rocky outcrop, silhouetted against the twilight sky. It was huge, way bigger than a man, and it moved in a way that wasn't human. It leaped from one ridge to another, maybe 20-30 feet apart, and it did it silently. No sound of landing, no rustling, just this smooth, effortless motion that made my stomach drop. I whispered, "What the hell is that?" under my breath, barely audible. And then the voice echoed back, but it wasn't my words. It was that distorted voice again, saying, "What the hell is that?" but in a mocking tone, followed by another giggle. That's when the terror really hit me. It was playing with me, toying with me. I felt like prey, and this thing was the predator, and it was enjoying it. The figure leaped again, closer this time, and I could see more details. It was built like a gorilla but stood upright, with broad shoulders and long arms. Its movements were impossibly fast. Blink, and you'd miss it. 1 second it was on one ridge, the next it was on another without any sound. I knew right then that this wasn't an animal I could identify. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist. And I was convinced, in that moment, that I was going to die. There was no way I could outrun it, no way to fight it. My mind raced through all the stories I'd heard about Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but this felt different, more personal, more malicious. I don't remember making the decision to run. My body just took over. I turned and bolted, not even grabbing my ruined backpack or anything. I just ran, stumbling through the trees, branches scraping my face and arms. I could hear the giggles fading behind me, but I didn't look back. I focused on one thing, getting to the next campsite I'd passed earlier in the day. I knew there was another camper there because I'd seen smoke from a fire when I was setting up my own camp. The run felt like forever. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but adrenaline kept me going. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept expecting to feel a hand on my shoulder or hear that voice right in my ear. When I finally saw the glow of a fire through the trees, I almost cried with relief. I burst into the clearing where the other camper was sitting by his fire, and I must have looked insane, covered in sweat, breathing like I'd run a marathon, eyes wide with fear. The guy stood up quickly, holding a stick like a weapon. "Whoa, easy there," he said. "You okay?" I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out right. I just pointed back toward my camp and stammered, "Puma. I think it was a puma." I don't know why I lied. Maybe I was embarrassed, or maybe I thought he wouldn't believe me if I told the truth. But saying it was a puma felt safer, more believable. He looked skeptical, but gestured for me to sit down. "Take a breath," he said. "You're shaking." I sat by the fire, and the warmth felt good, but I couldn't stop trembling. My hands were shaking so bad I had to clasp them together. He offered me some water, and I drank it greedily. We sat in silence for a few minutes, him occasionally throwing a log on the fire, me just staring into the flames, trying to process what had happened. After a while, I started to feel a little calmer, but the fear was still there, like a cold weight in my chest. I knew I had to tell him the truth, so I took a deep breath and said, "It wasn't a puma. I don't know what it was." And I spilled everything. The tent in the tree, the stolen food, the giggles, the voice, the figure leaping across the ridges. I expected him to laugh or tell me I was crazy, but he didn't. He just listened, his expression serious. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "I've heard stories," he said. "Not many, but enough to know you're not the first." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push it. We stayed up most of the night, taking turns keeping watch. Though neither of us slept much, every little noise made us jump. At one point, I thought I heard that giggle again, far off in the distance, but it might have been the wind. The next morning, we packed up together and hiked out. We exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch, which we did for a while, mostly just checking in to make sure we were both okay. But I never went on another solo trip after that. I still camp, but only with groups, and I stick to more populated areas. What happened that night changed me. I don't talk about it much because how do you explain something like that? People either think you're lying or you've lost your mind. But I know what I saw and heard, that voice echoing my words, that figure moving with impossible speed. It stuck with me. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, hearing that giggle, and I have to check the locks on my doors. I'll never forget the feeling of being toyed with, like I was just entertainment for something that wasn't human. And I still can't explain it. Not then, not now. Story 5. It was December 17th, 1997. I remember the date because it was my buddy's idea, and because nothing's ever been the same since. We were up in the mountains of Tennessee in my beat-up Ford pickup. My friend, she's a serious outdoors person, hunter, hiker, the whole deal. She's the one who said we should go up to this clearing she knew about to see the view under the full moon. It was cold, The kind of cold that gets deep into your bones and makes your joints ache. The sky was clear though, and the moon was so bright it almost felt like a weak, blue-tinted sun. We drove up this winding gravel road for what felt like forever. The trees were thick, mostly bare except for some pines, and everything was covered in a crusty old layer of snow. We finally got to this spot, a road cut along the edge of the mountain. It was just a wide patch of gravel where the loggers must have turned around. She had me back my truck in, so the headlights were pointing down the mountain, just in case another vehicle came up behind us. We were just sitting there in the dark, engine off, talking about nothing, watching our breath fog up the inside of the windshield. We must have been there for about an hour. The cold was winning. I could feel it coming up through the floorboards, and my fingers were starting to go numb, even inside my gloves. I said, "Screw this. I'm turning the truck on for a minute, just for the heat." I turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life, and that blast of warm air from the vents was the best feeling in the world. The headlights clicked on, cutting two bright paths through the trees down the slope. That's when we saw the boar. It was down there, maybe 60, 70 yards away, rooting around in the snow with its snout. A big, full-grown thing, dark and bristly. We just sat and watched it. It was cool, you know, a piece of the wild, just doing its thing. We watched it for a good 10 minutes, not saying much, just sipping the coffee from my thermos. Then, all of a sudden, it froze. Its head snapped up, and it wasn't rooting anymore. It was just staring up the slope toward our left. It stood there for a second, totally rigid, and then it just bolted. It didn't run away from us. It scrambled straight up the steep embankment to our left, moving faster than I ever thought something that big could move. It crashed through the undergrowth and was gone in seconds. The woods went dead silent again. My friend and I just looked at each other. "What spooked it?" I whispered. I turned the truck off. The heater died, and the silence that rushed in was heavy, thick. We were both listening, straining to hear anything. The only sound was the faint ticking of the engine as it cooled. We were staring into the trees where the boar had been looking. At first, I thought it was a black bear. That was my brain's first, most logical guess. It was a dark shape, deeper than the shadows around it, moving between the tree trunks. It was big, but I figured, okay, a big bear. That explains the boar running. Then it stepped out into the open. It came out from behind a thick pine and just rose up. It didn't crouch and then stand. It was like it unfolded itself to its full height. And that's when my brain just broke. That wasn't a bear. A bear stands on its hind legs, but it's hunched, it's awkward, its front paws just dangle. This thing stood up straight, like a man, a giant, impossibly huge man. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard, I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't breathe. I just stared. It had to be 8.5 feet tall. Its arms were long, way too long, and they hung down past its knees. They swung slightly as it took a step. It was covered in dark hair, but it wasn't shaggy like a bear's. It looked more like thick, matted fur. "Turn on the lights," my friend said, her voice a tight, thin thread of sound. My hand was shaking so bad I fumbled with the keys, almost dropped them. I finally got the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine coughed to life, and I shoved the headlight knob in. The high beams blasted the thing. It froze right in the middle of the road, maybe 40 yards in front of us. The light hit it full on, and it brought its arm up like a person would to shield its eyes from the glare. It didn't snarl or roar. It looked confused, lost. That was almost worse than if it had been aggressive, and its eyes. In the direct light, they didn't shine like an animal's. They had this glow, but it wasn't a flat reflection. It was an amber color, with a reddish tint deep inside, like two hot coals. It was a living, intelligent look. It wasn't the dumb stare of a deer or the aggressive glare of a bear. It made a sound then, a low guttural grunt that came from deep in its chest, and with the sound I saw its breath. Steam billowed out of its mouth and nostrils in huge plumes, lit up by my headlights. The air was so cold, and this thing was so alive. So hot inside, It lowered its arm from its eyes and seemed to look right at us, right through the windshield. It took a step, not a run, not a charge, just one deliberate step in our direction. That's when I lost it. I slammed my hand down on the steering wheel, right on the horn. The sound was deafening in the silent night. A long, blaring honk that echoed off the mountains. The thing jolted. It was a full-body flinch, like it had been struck. It recoiled, took a stumbling step back, and then it moved. It didn't run away from the road. It crossed it. It took 3 steps. 3. That's all it took for it to go from the middle of the road to the other side. Its stride was unbelievable, each step covering a dozen feet. It was at the edge of the tree line, and there was a young sapling, maybe 3 inches thick. It didn't break stride. It reached out with one of those long, dark arms, wrapped its hand around the trunk of that sapling and pulled. It wasn't climbing, it was pulling itself up the mountain. It used that sapling like a rope, hauling its immense weight up the steep, snowy slope with a raw, brutal power that made my stomach clench. There was no struggle. It was effortless. It moved into the trees, and the shadows just swallowed it. 1 second it was there, a massive silhouette against the snow, and the next, it was gone, vanished. The woods were empty. The silence came back, but it was different now. It was a terrified silence. Then I heard a wet, tearing sound, and a sharp, acrid smell hit my nose. I looked over at my friend. She was pressed against her door, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the spot where the thing had disappeared. Her jeans were dark and wet. She had lost control of her bladder. This is a woman who has field-dressed elk, who isn't scared of anything in these woods, and she had just pissed herself in sheer, unadulterated terror. She let out a choked gasp, then a full-on scream. "Go! Go! Go! Get us out of here! Now!" I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed the gear shift into drive and stomped on the gas. The tires spun in the gravel for a heart-stopping second before they caught, and the truck lurched forward. I didn't care about being careful on the winding road. I drove like a maniac, my hands glued to the wheel, my eyes flicking between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, expecting to see that dark form chasing us, those amber-red eyes glowing in the dark. The cab of the truck filled with the smell, a foul mix of urine and the sharp, sour stink of our own fear sweat. We didn't speak, we didn't say a word the whole way down the mountain. She was sobbing quietly, just this ragged, hopeless sound. I was shaking so hard I could barely keep the truck on the road. We hit the main paved road, and I didn't slow down. I just kept driving, putting as much distance between us and that mountain as I could. The whole world outside the truck felt different. The dark trees lining the road weren't just trees anymore. They were hiding places. The night wasn't peaceful. It was watching us. We got back to her place just as the sky was starting to lighten from black to a deep, cold gray. We sat in my truck in her driveway for a few minutes, engine running, neither of us wanting to get out. The normalcy of her suburban street felt like a lie. She finally opened her door, and without looking at me, she just said, "I can't talk about this, not ever." Then she got out and walked to her house, her steps unsteady. I drove home. I took a shower so hot it scalded my skin, but I couldn't get warm. I couldn't get the image out of my head. The way it stood up, the way it moved, the look in its eyes, that intelligent, confused, almost pained look. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep properly for weeks. Every branch tapping on my window was a footstep. Every creak of the house was a grunt. I kept the lights on in my bedroom. That was more than 2 decades ago. I've never gone back to that clearing. My friend and I, we never spoke about it again. It was like an unspoken agreement. We just pretended it didn't happen. Because to acknowledge it was to admit that the world wasn't the safe, known place we thought it was. It was to admit that there are things in the deep, dark woods that don't fit in any book, things that stand on 2 legs and look back at you with ancient, knowing eyes. I still dream about it sometimes. I wake up in a cold sweat, The smell of urine and fear and cold pine needles filling my nose, the sound of that horn blaring in my ears, and the sight of that massive dark form pulling itself up a mountain and vanishing into the trees. Forever. Story 6. We'd finished up with dinner, just some burgers I'd thrown on the grill, and were inside with the AC cranked, the TV on for noise more than anything. The windows were closed tight against the humidity, but you could still hear the cicadas buzzing, a constant, statusy hum that was the soundtrack to every summer night out there. It was probably around 9:30. The sun had been down for a while, but the heat hadn't broken. That's when the first sound cut through. It wasn't the cicadas. It was lower, deeper, coming from right outside, from the direction of the cornfield that starts about 50 feet from the back porch. It was a grunt, not a pig grunt, not a deer snort. This was chesty. It came from something with a big set of lungs, a deep guttural huh, like the sound a big man makes when he's heaving a heavy weight. I muted the TV and held up a hand to my son. His eyes got wide, fixed on me. "You hear that?" I whispered. He just nodded, his fork still hovering over his plate of half-eaten potato salad. Then it came again, the same grunt, but this time it was followed by another one, slightly different in pitch. And then a third sound, a kind of throaty bellow that wasn't loud, not like a scream, but it carried. It was a wet, rumbling sound that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong. Not in Iowa, not in my field, not anywhere. My son's voice was a thin thread. "Dad, what is that?" "Probably just a couple coons fighting," I said, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. Raccoons don't sound like that. Nothing I'd ever heard in 50 years of spending time on that land sounded like that. The feeling in my gut was a cold, tight knot. This was wrong. I got up and went to the back door, peering through the little window in the top half. Nothing but pitch black past the glow of the porch light. The corn was a solid wall of darkness. "Stay here," I told him, but he was already right behind me, his hand gripping the back of my t-shirt. I grabbed the big mag light from the hook by the door, the heavy metal one that feels like you could bludgeon something with it. My heart was thumping a steady, nervous rhythm against my ribs. I unlocked the deadbolt, the click sounding way too loud, and slowly pushed the screen door open. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It rolled over us on the still, humid air. It was a foul, musky odor, like a dog that's been out in the rain for a week, mixed with something else, something rotten, like old meat and wet, matted fur. It was so strong it made my eyes water a little. I saw my son wrinkle his nose, his face pale in the porch light. I clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut a shaky path through the darkness, sweeping across the lawn and landing on the edge of the cornfield. And that's when I saw the corn wasn't still. It was moving. Not from the wind. There was no wind. It was swaying and parting in a wide path, maybe 15, 20 feet across, like something big was pushing its way through. You could hear the stalks rustling and cracking, a dry, brittle sound that was getting closer. "Shine the light, Dad," my son whispered, his voice trembling. I tightened my grip on the mag light, my palm slick with sweat, and aimed it down the path of moving corn. The beam jittered. My hand wasn't steady. We took a few steps off the porch, onto the damp grass. The smell got stronger, that wet fur and decay stench, and it was coming from the field. We got to the old post and wire fence that separates the yard from the field, maybe 30 feet from the house. I leaned over, pointing the light directly into the swaying corridor of corn, and that's when I saw them. My brain just stuttered. It couldn't make sense of what my eyes were seeing. Two of them. They were upright, walking side by side, and they were huge. I'm 6 feet tall, and these things had to be over 7 feet. Easy. They were covered in hair, dark brown, almost black in the flashlight beam, long and shaggy. It wasn't like a bear. Bears don't walk like that, so straight, with such a smooth, powerful gait. Their arms were long, swinging at their sides. They were maybe 60, 70 yards into the field, just these two massive dark figures moving through the corn like it was nothing. The corn stalks were level with their waists. I could hear the heavy, rhythmic crunch of their footsteps, even over the sound of the stalks breaking. I was frozen. I just stood there, the flashlight beam glued to them. My son was clutching my arm so hard his fingernails were digging into my skin. He let out a small, choked sound. Then, the one on the right turned its head. It looked right at us. The light caught its face and my stomach dropped straight down to my feet. It had a heavy, sloped forehead, like its brow ridge was a solid shelf of bone. Its neck was thick, powerful, connecting to these massive shoulders, and its eyes. They were deep set, but they reflected the light back at us, 2 points of brilliant, awful yellow. There was no expression I could read, no anger or curiosity. It was just a look, an awareness. It knew we were there. It knew we were watching. It stopped walking. The other one stopped too. For a second, everything was silent, except for the frantic buzz of the cicadas and the blood pounding in my ears. Then the bigger one, the one on the left that hadn't turned, let out a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. It wasn't a grunt this time. It was a roar, a deep, aggressive, chest-shattering roar that seemed to start in its guts and tear its way out. It wasn't high-pitched, it was low and resonant, and it echoed across the field, drowning out every other sound. I felt the vibration of it in my own chest. It was a challenge, a threat. And then they charged. They didn't drop to all fours. They stayed upright and just launched forward, thrashing through the corn with these heavy, purposeful, terrifyingly fast strides. The corn exploded around them, stalks snapping and flying. The sound was a deafening, crashing wave coming right at us. I could hear their breath now, these loud, huffing grunts like a locomotive building steam. The spell broke. Pure animal terror took over. "Run!" I screamed, and I don't even remember turning. I just did. I grabbed my son's arm and yanked him, half dragging him, and we sprinted for the house. The grass was slick under my boots. I've never run so fast in my life, and it felt like I was moving through syrup. Every muscle was screaming. I could hear them behind us, the pounding of their feet. Thump, thump, thump. A sound so heavy and solid it was like hearing drums made of stone and flesh. It was shaking the ground. Their grunts were right there, right behind our heads, that wet, hot, breathy sound. My son was sobbing, a ragged, gasping sound, but he was keeping up, his legs pumping. I didn't dare look back. I just focused on the back door, that square of yellow light that seemed 1,000,000 miles away. The crashing in the corn was right on top of us. The smell was suffocating. We hit the bottom of the porch steps and scrambled up them, our feet slipping on the wooden boards. I shoved my son through the door ahead of me, and I spun around in the doorway, flashlight still clutched in my hand, my heart trying to hammer its way out of my chest. They had stopped. They were right at the edge of the yard, right where the mowed grass met the tall weeds of the field. The bigger one was standing there, broad-shouldered, its chest heaving. It was even bigger up close. The porch light fell on it, and I saw its eyes weren't yellow anymore. They were a deep, glowing red, like hot coals. It just stood there, staring at me, its massive arms hanging at its sides. The hair on its body was matted and dark. I could see the power in it, a raw, physical presence that felt ancient and wild. The other one was gone. I hadn't even seen it go. It had just vanished into the tree line by the creek. We stood there, frozen in a standoff for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 5 seconds. Me, panting, dripping with sweat, holding a stupid flashlight like a weapon. It just standing there, silent now, those red eyes burning into me. There was an intelligence in that look, a cold, calculating awareness that was more frightening than any mindless rage could have been. Then, without a sound, it turned. It moved with a strange, fluid grace for something so huge, and in 2 strides, it melted back into the shadows of the cornfield and was gone. The crashing sound stopped. The grunts stopped. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and my son's quiet, terrified crying from just inside the door. I stood on that porch for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, just staring into the darkness, the flashlight beam shaking as I swept it back and forth across the field. Nothing. The corn was still again. The smell was already starting to fade, carried away on the same still air that had brought it. I finally backed into the house, my legs feeling like jelly, and slammed the door shut, throwing the deadbolt and latching the chain with trembling fingers. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door, trying to catch my breath, trying to make my heart slow down. We didn't sleep that night. We sat in the living room with all the lights on, not talking, just listening. Every creak of the old house, every pop from the fridge made us jump. My son sat curled in a ball on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, just staring into space. The sound he was most stuck on, the one he whispered to me once, was the sound of their footsteps charging through the corn. He said it was like the earth itself was angry. The next morning, when the sun was fully up and the world looked normal and safe again, I forced myself to go outside. The grass was dewy, the birds were singing. It all looked so peaceful. I walked to the fence line. The evidence was there, undeniable. A wide path of corn, maybe 18 feet across, was completely trampled flat, the stalks broken and pushed down into the mud. It started deep in the field and went in a straight, brutal line right up to the edge of our yard. And there, in the soft, wet dirt right at the fence, were the footprints. They were huge. I knelt down to look. They were easily 15 inches long and wide. They looked almost human, but the proportions were wrong. Wider at the ball of the foot, a shallower arch. They were pressed deep into the ground, showing immense weight. I placed my own boot next to one. My size 11 looked like a child's print, and the smell was still there, faint but unmistakable, that sour, musky odor clinging to the broken stalks. We never talked about it to anyone. Not the sheriff, not the neighbors. Who would believe us? We'd be the crazy guys who saw Bigfoot. We sold the farm a month later, took a loss on it, and moved into a little house in town where the only thing outside your window is your neighbor's fence. My son started having nightmares, and to be honest, so did I. It's been years now, but I still think about it all the time. Not just the size of them, or the roar, or the red eyes. It was the way they moved together, that coordinated movement. It wasn't random, it was purposeful. They were working as a pair, and that moment when they stopped at the yard's edge, they didn't cross it. It was like a line they decided not to cross. The intelligence in that, the chilling, calculated decision-making, is what haunts me more than anything else. We never heard them again after that night in late July. They were just gone. But I know, with a certainty that sits like a stone in my gut, that they're still out there, and they know we saw them. Story 7. Okay, so I'm just gonna type this out because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone here will believe me or even have had something similar happen. I've never told this to many people because it sounds insane, but it's been eating at me for years, and I still get chills thinking about it. This happened when I was a kid, maybe around 10 or 11 years old, living in this small town called Wren. It's about 5 miles west of Philimouth, if you know the area. Mostly woods and swamps, the kind of place where you could get lost real easy if you weren't careful. That day, it was a Saturday, I think, because I didn't have school, and I'd been begging my parents to let me build a tree fort in the woods behind our house. They finally said yes, so I grabbed some old boards, a hammer, nails, and a rope from the shed, and I headed out around mid-morning. The air was thick and humid, the kind of day where your shirt sticks to your back after just a few minutes outside. I remember the sun was trying to break through the clouds, but it wasn't doing a great job. Everything felt kind of grey and muted, like the world was holding its breath. I'd been out in those woods a lot before this, especially after this other weird thing that happened near Philimouth a few months earlier. I don't want to get into that now, But let's just say I'd already had this feeling that something wasn't right in those trees. Not like a monster movie kind of thing, but more like a low-level dread that would creep up on me sometimes when I was alone out there. Anyway, that day, I was determined to build this fort in a spot I'd picked out. A swampy area with a bunch of alder trees and tall grass that came up to my waist. It was a dumb place to build anything, honestly, because the ground was soggy and the trees were kind of skinny. But I liked it because it felt hidden, like my own little secret world. I'd been working for a couple of hours, sweating and getting mosquito bites all over my arms. I had this one board nailed up between two trees, and I was trying to climb onto it to test if it would hold my weight. The bark was rough under my hands, and I could feel splinters digging into my palms. My heart was pounding from the effort, and I remember thinking how cool it would be to have a place to hide out and read comics or whatever. But as I pulled myself up, my foot slipped on a wet patch of moss, and I fell. It wasn't a huge fall, maybe only 6 or 7 feet, but it knocked the wind out of me, and I landed hard on my side in the mud. For a second, I just lay there, gasping and trying to catch my breath. The mud was cold and squishy, seeping through my jeans, and I could smell that earthy, rotten smell you get in swamps, like wet leaves and decay. I pushed myself up, my arms trembling, and that's when I saw it. About 12 feet away, behind a thick alder tree, there was this dark shape. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, or maybe a deer, but then it moved. Or rather, it didn't move. It was just standing there, perfectly still. My heart started racing even faster, and I froze. Not because I was trying to be quiet, but because I couldn't make my body do anything else. I was crouched in the mud, my knees aching, and I just stared. The thing was about 5'7" tall, which is shorter than I expected for something like this, but it had these enormous sloped shoulders that made it look powerful, like a wrestler or something. Its arms were crazy long, hanging down past its knees, and they were thick, like tree branches. The whole thing was covered in short black hair that looked shiny, almost wet, like it had been swimming or something. The hair was so dense that I could barely see its face, but what I could see was this low-set head, kind of tucked down, like it was trying to hide. But the weirdest part was that it was breathing. I could hear it, this deep, steady rhythm, like someone taking slow, calm breaths. And the smell hit me then, stronger than the swamp smell. It was earthy, like wet bark and soil, but with a musky undertone that made my stomach twist. I'd never smelled anything like it before, and it made the air feel heavy, like I was breathing in something alive. I don't know how long I stayed like that, just staring, but it felt like forever. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a bear? But bears don't stand like that, and they don't have arms that long. Plus, the hair was too short and uniform. Then it turned its head slightly, not looking at me but past me, like it was checking something out in the distance. That small movement sent a jolt of pure terror through me. It wasn't aggressive or anything, it was calm, almost casual, like it was just going about its business. But that made it worse, because it felt so deliberate, so intelligent. Then, without making a sound, it pivoted on its feet and started walking into the denser brush. Its steps were light but firm, like it knew exactly where it was going, and it didn't rustle the leaves or snap any twigs. It just melted into the trees, and within seconds it was gone. The forest went dead silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was like everything had stopped to watch it leave. I stayed frozen for what felt like minutes, maybe longer. My legs were cramping from crouching, and my hands were still pressed into the mud, cold and numb. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest, so loud I thought it might burst out. Slowly, I managed to stand up, my whole body shaking. I looked around, but there was nothing there, just the trees, the swamp, and that eerie silence. The smell lingered for a bit, that wet bark scent, and it made me feel sick. I didn't run right away. I just stood there, trying to process what I'd seen. My brain kept replaying the image, those sloped shoulders, the long arms, the way it moved so quietly. It wasn't like in movies where monsters roar or chase you. This thing was just there, and then it wasn't, and it left me with this deep, gut-wrenching fear that I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. After a while, I gathered my stuff and hurried back home, my feet squelching in the mud. I didn't tell my parents because I knew they'd think I was making it up or that I'd hit my head when I fell, but I never went back to that spot again. For weeks, I'd have nightmares about it, waking up in a cold sweat, remembering that calm demeanor and how it didn't even seem to care that I was there. That was the last time I saw it, but the image is burned into my mind. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and see it standing there, breathing deeply, like it belonged in those woods more than I did. It reinforced this idea that Sasquatches are real, not as monsters, but as something living out there, hidden and quiet. And sometimes, when I'm in a quiet place, I'll catch a whiff of that earthy smell, and my heart will skip a beat, like it's reminding me that I was never alone out there. I still don't have any answers, and I probably never will. It's just one of those things that happened, and I'm left with this chill that never really goes away. Story 8. It's funny how some fears from your childhood just stick with you, you know? They're like a splinter buried deep under your skin that you can't dig out. And every once in a while, something presses on it and the whole memory flares up, sharp and fresh. For me, that fear has a name and a place. The place is my grandparents' old cabin, tucked away in the woods outside of Belmont, Nebraska. The name, well, we never gave it one. We didn't have to. I was just a kid, maybe 7 or 8 the first time I heard it. We were up at the cabin for a family thing, one of those long summer evenings where the light just won't quit. I was outside chasing fireflies when this sound ripped through the canyon. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. It was a yell, but it was so loud, so deep, it felt like it was coming from inside my own chest. It was a roar that had words in it, but words I couldn't understand, full of this pure, raw anger. It echoed off the hills, bouncing back and forth until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I froze solid, my little jar of fireflies forgotten. My heart wasn't just beating fast, it felt like a bird trying to smash its way out of a cage. I ran inside, crying, babbling about a monster. My dad just chuckled. "Settle down, buddy," he said, ruffling my hair. "That's just an old cow. They can make some funny noises when they're upset." A cow. Even at that age, I knew that was bullshit. I'd been around cows my whole life. They moo, they low. They don't scream a challenge that makes the hair on your arms stand up. But what was I gonna do? Argue? I was a kid. So I just buried it. But that sound never left me. It became the background noise to every nightmare I had for years. Because of that, I never wanted to stay overnight. I'd come up for day trips, but as soon as the sun started to dip below the trees, I'd get this tight, anxious feeling in my gut, and I'd beg to go home. It wasn't until I was in my late teens that I finally spent a night there. And even then, I slept with the lights on. Fast forward to my early 20s. I guess I thought I'd outgrown it. I was feeling brave, or maybe just stupid, and I decided it would be a cool idea to invite my best friend up for a weekend. Let's call him Mike. He'd never been, and I painted this picture of a peaceful, rustic getaway. I didn't mention the scream. Some part of me had almost convinced myself my dad was right, that it was just a cow, and the rest was a kid's overactive imagination. We got there after dark. The cabin doesn't have a driveway right up to it. You have to park at the top of a ridge and carry your stuff down a winding, narrow trail for about a quarter mile. It's not a long walk, but at night, with only a couple of flashlights, it feels a lot longer. The woods are thick there, all oak and pine, and the canopy is so dense that even on a full moon night, it's pitch black. That night, the air was cool and still, and every little sound, a twig snapping, the rustle of leaves, seemed amplified. We hauled our coolers and duffel bags down the path, the beams from our flashlights dancing over the gnarled roots and rocks. I was leading the way, and I could feel that old familiar prickle on the back of my neck. I kept telling myself to relax, that I was an adult now, but my body wasn't listening. My shoulders were tense, and I was gripping the handle of my cooler way too tight. We got the cabin unlocked, got the lights on. That always helps. The yellow glow from the old kerosene lamps pushes back the shadows and makes the place feel safe, contained. We decided to fire up the old charcoal grill on the stone patio out back. I'd brought some nice thick ribeyes. We were laughing, cracking open a couple of beers, starting to unwind. The initial creepiness of the night walk was fading. We got the grill going, the coals turning a fierce, glowing red. That's when we realized we'd forgotten the potatoes and the seasoning rub. They were in a separate grocery bag, and we must have left it up by the car. Mike volunteered to go get it. He took the big LED flashlight, the really powerful one that can throw a beam a couple hundred yards, and headed back up the trail. I stayed behind to tend to the stakes. About 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Mike. "Dude, I can't find the bag," he said, his voice a little staticky. "You sure we left it up here?" I was sure. It's a white plastic bag. It should be right by the driver's side door of my truck. Well, it's not. I've looked all around the truck, nothing. That was weird, annoying, but weird. We needed those potatoes. "All right, hang on," I said. "I'll come up and help you look." I grabbed my own flashlight, a smaller one, and started back up the trail. The woods felt different now. The silence was heavier. It's hard to explain, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a waiting quiet. I met Mike at the top of the ridge by my truck. We swept our lights all over the gravel parking area under the truck in the bushes nearby. Nothing. "This is stupid," Mike muttered. "Maybe it fell out on the trail." So we started walking back down the path, slower this time, scanning the ground carefully with our lights. We were about halfway back to the cabin when my beam caught something white off to the side of the trail. Not on the trail, but about 15 feet up the steep, brush-covered slope to our left. It was the bag. "What the hell?" Mike said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "How did it get all the way up there?" A cold knot tightened in my stomach. There was no reason for that bag to be there. We hadn't gone up that hill. It was too steep, too overgrown with thorny bushes and loose shale. Someone or something had moved it. I took a step off the trail and started climbing up toward it. The ground was uneven and dry branches snapped under my boots. "Just grab it and let's go," Mike said from the trail below. He sounded nervous. I was focused on the bag, my light fixed on it, when I heard it. It was a sound directly behind me, further up the slope. It wasn't the random crunch of me walking. This was a deliberate, heavy step. Then another. Something was walking, and it was walking on two legs. You know how you can tell the difference? A deer or a coyote moves with a lighter, more skittering gait. This was a heavy, bipedal thud. Step, crunch, step. I froze. My blood went cold. Every hair on my body stood straight up. It was the same feeling I had as a kid, that primal gut-level terror that screams, "Predator!" "Mike," I whispered, but it came out as a dry croak. The footsteps were coming down the slope toward me. They were slow, deliberate. It wasn't trying to be quiet. It was moving through the thick brush like it wasn't even there. I could hear the branches swishing and snapping under its weight. It was closing the distance, my brain short-circuited. I couldn't move. I just stood there, listening to this thing walk toward me in the dark. I felt its presence, a massive, solid pressure in the air behind me. I knew without a doubt that if I turned around, I would see it, and I knew I did not want to see it. Then the footsteps stopped, just stopped. The woods went dead silent again, that awful waiting silence. It had stopped maybe 20, 30 feet behind me. I could feel it there. I could smell it. It's a smell I'll never forget. A mix of wet dog, rotten meat, and something else. Something musky and foul, like a bog. I heard Mike's shaky voice from the trail. What What is that? He could hear it too. He could smell it. This wasn't my imagination. And then, the most terrifying sound of the night. A loud, sharp snap. The sound of a thick, dead branch. Something as big around as my wrist being broken in two. It wasn't stepped on. It was broken, like someone or something had snapped it with its hands to get our attention. That sound broke the spell on Mike. I heard a strangled gasp, and then the sound of his feet pounding down the trail toward the cabin. He was running for his life. He didn't say a word. He just ran and left me there. I was alone on the hillside with it. Adrenaline finally flooded my system. I fumbled under my jacket, my hands shaking so badly I could barely function. I pulled out my Glock 19, the cool, hard metal feeling both comforting and terrifyingly small in my hand. I thumbed the safety off. I still hadn't turned around. I was too scared. Slowly, carefully, I started backing down the hill toward the trail. I kept my flashlight pointed down, illuminating the ground at my feet. I didn't want to sweep it up the hill. I had this overpowering, instinctive feeling that if I shined a light on it, if I saw it, that would be it. That would be the trigger. So I walked backwards, one slow, shuffling step at a time, my gun held tight in a two-handed grip, pointed at the ground. I could still feel it there, just 20 feet away in the darkness. I could hear its breathing now. It was a low, rumbling sound, like air moving through a huge, hollow log. It wasn't panting. It was just breathing, watching me. Every second of that walk back to the cabin felt like an hour. My back was to the cabin, to safety, and I was staring into the impenetrable blackness of the woods, knowing something was staring back. I expected it to charge at any moment. I expected to hear those heavy footsteps crashing down the hill toward me. I kept waiting for it. I finally made it to the trail, then backed all the way to the cabin. I fumbled with the door handle, my eyes still locked on the tree line, and practically fell inside. I slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt, my chest heaving. Mike was white as a sheet, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. He just looked at me, his eyes wide with sheer panic. We didn't sleep that night. We sat in the main room with all the lights on, my gun on the table between us, listening. We didn't hear the footsteps again. But a few times we heard something else, something big moving around the perimeter of the cabin, brushing against the walls. Once, something heavy leaned against the back door, making the old wood creak under the strain. We just looked at each other, too terrified to even speak. The steaks were still on the grill, burned to a crisp. We didn't care. We left at first light, not even bothering to pack everything up. We just got in the truck and drove, not saying a word for the first hour of the trip. That was my confirmation. That thing, whatever it was real. The childhood scream wasn't a cow. It was this, but the story doesn't even end there. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place months later, on the 4th of July. We had a big family party at the cabin. I was still jumpy, but with 20 people around, grilling and setting off fireworks, it felt safe. The noise and the light kept the fear at bay. Later that night, after most people had left or gone to bed, a couple who had stayed behind were sitting by the dying fire pit. They were city folk, not used to the woods. The husband came inside to get a drink, and he looked spooked. "Hey," he said to me, his voice low. "You guys have any bears around here?" My heart sank. "No," I said slowly. "No bears in Nebraska. Why?" "We heard something big moving around up on the hill," he said, pointing toward the slope where I'd had my encounter. Sounded like a person, but bigger, heavier, and my wife swears she saw something. I went outside with him. His wife was standing by the fire, arms wrapped around herself, staring up at the dark tree line. "What did you see?" I asked her, trying to keep my voice calm. She wouldn't look away from the hill. "It was just for a second," she whispered. "The moon was behind the clouds, but then it came out. I saw an outline, a silhouette against the sky." She took a shaky breath. "It was tall. so tall, and its shoulders, they were massive. It was shaped like a man, but no man is built like that. It was just standing there, watching us. She finally turned to look at me, and her face was pale and serious. I've never seen anything like it. It was bigger than any human being could possibly be. I just nodded. I didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say. She had seen it. They had both heard it. It was real. That series of encounters from my childhood to that night with Mike to the 4th of July sealed it for me. There is something in those woods. I don't go into the woods after dark anymore. Not ever. And sometimes, when the wind is just right or the house is too quiet, I can still hear that scream from when I was 7 years old, echoing through the canyon. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that it was never a cow. It was a warning, and we were stupid enough to not listen. Story 9. It was one of those perfect August days, the kind that gets stuck in your head because it starts so normal you never see the end coming. This was back in 2015. My cousin and I had driven out to Olympic National Park, to Lake Crescent specifically. We'd been there a bunch of times before. It was our spot. You know how you have a place that just feels like yours? That was it for us. That day was a scorcher. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of heat that makes the pine trees smell even stronger. The parking lot was pretty full, but we knew a little cove most people didn't bother with, about a 20-minute walk from the main beach area. You had to scramble over some rocks and through a narrow path in the ferns to get to it, but it was worth it. Your own private slice of the lake. The water in Lake Crescent is this crazy, almost unreal shade of blue, so clear you can see the rounded stones on the bottom even when it's deep. We dumped our towels and the cooler on a flat, sun-warmed rock and got right in. The water was cold, a real shock to the system, but after a minute it just felt amazing. We were just messing around, laughing, the way you do when you're with family, and there's no pressure to be anything. We'd been in for maybe half an hour just floating and talking about nothing when I decided to float on my back for a bit. I remember closing my eyes, just feeling the sun on my face and the gentle rock of the water. It was so peaceful. The only sounds were my cousin splashing a little ways off and the faint lapping of water against the shore. I opened my eyes to adjust my position, tilting my head back to look at the shoreline behind me. That's when I saw it. The cove was shaped like a little crescent moon, hence the lake's name, I guess, and the far side was thick with old-growth trees, their shadows deep and dark even in the middle of the day. From that darkness, something stepped out. My brain didn't process it right away. It was just a shape, a tall, dark shape. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks with the sun and the water, but it didn't go away. It just stood there at the tree line, right where the rocky beach met the forest. It was big. I don't mean tall, I mean big. Its shoulders were massive, hunched and wide, and it was covered from head to toe in this shaggy dark brown hair that was almost black in the shadows. It wasn't a bear. I've seen black bears out there before. This was different. It stood on 2 legs, but it wasn't a person. It was too big, too wrong. Its proportions were off. The arms were long, hanging down past its knees, and its eyes, they were large and dark, like 2 pools of oil. They weren't reflecting the light, they were just absorbing it, and they were locked right on me. A cold feeling, totally separate from the lake's chill, shot right through my gut. I stopped floating, and my feet instinctively dropped down, searching for the bottom. I found it. The stones slick under my feet, and I just stood there, waist deep in the water, frozen. I couldn't look away, I couldn't even breathe. "Hey," I whispered, but it came out as a croak. My cousin was maybe 15 feet to my left, facing away from the shore, diving under the water and coming back up. The thing didn't move. It was a statue, a terrifying, living statue carved out of shadow and muscle. I could see its chest moving, a slow, deep rhythm. I could make out more details now that my eyes were adjusting. The hair wasn't uniform. It was matted in places, longer on its head and shoulders. Its face was flat, with a heavy brow that shadowed those dark eyes. Then it made a sound. It started as a low rumble, so deep I felt it in my bones more than I heard it. It was like the vibration you feel when a big truck drives by your house. But this was coming from the woods, from it. The sound rolled across the water, a guttural, resonant hum that made the air feel thick. My cousin heard it. He stopped splashing and turned around. I saw his face go from confused to pale in half a second. His eyes went wide, and he followed my gaze to the tree line. "Oh, shit," he breathed out. It wasn't a yell, just a statement of pure, simple terror. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It was a heavy, waiting silence. The creature's head tilted slightly, its gaze shifting from me to my cousin and then back to me. It was studying us. Then its lips pulled back. It wasn't a smile, it was a snarl. It revealed a mouth full of large, blocky teeth. They weren't white. They were a dirty, yellowish color, and they looked thick, like they could crush rock. The rumble started again, but this time it was louder, more aggressive, a warning, and then the smell hit me. It was like a physical wave, a foul, musky odor, like a mixture of wet dog, rotten meat, and something else, something deeply animal and unclean. It was so strong, it made my eyes water and my stomach clench. I gagged, bringing a hand up to my mouth. The smell seemed to cling to the back of my throat. That's when my cousin broke. He didn't scream. He let out a kind of strangled yelp and started scrambling backwards through the water, his arms flailing, trying to get to shore. The movement was frantic, clumsy. He was panicking. The creature's reaction was instantaneous. The low rumble erupted into a full-blown, thunderous roar. I can't even describe the sound properly. It wasn't just loud, it was immense. It felt like it came from the center of the earth. It was a deep, raw, tearing sound that ripped through the peaceful quiet of the cove and echoed off the surrounding hills. The sound hit me in the chest, a physical pressure that made my heart stutter. I felt it in my teeth. Every hair on my body stood straight up. It was the most primal, terrifying sound I have ever heard in my life. It was the sound of something that owned this place, and we were trespassing. The roar seemed to go on forever, but it was probably only a few seconds. As it faded, the echoes bounced across the lake, a repeating, fading testament to what had just happened. The creature took a single, heavy step forward onto the rocky beach. Its large, dark feet looked almost human, but they were too broad, the toes too long. It wasn't running at us, it was just advancing, staking its claim. That broke my own paralysis. I turned and started churning through the water towards the shore where our stuff was. It was like running in a nightmare. The water that had felt so refreshing moments before was now a thick, resisting glue, pulling at my legs, slowing me down with every step. I could hear my cousin ahead of me, his bare feet slapping on the wet rocks, his breathing coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it there. I could still smell that god-awful stench hanging in the air. I stumbled onto the rocky beach, my feet screaming in pain as I ran over sharp stones. I didn't care. My only thought was the car. The car was safety. The car was doors and locks and an engine. My cousin was already grabbing his towel and shoes, not even bothering to put them on. He just scooped everything up in a messy bundle. I did the same, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip my own towel. I fumbled with the cooler, but my cousin yelled, "Leave it!" and the sheer panic in his voice made me drop it. The plastic lid popped open and our water bottles and sandwiches spilled out onto the rocks. We ran up that narrow path through the ferns, branches whipping at our arms and faces. We didn't speak. The only sounds were our pounding feet, our desperate wheezing breaths, and the rustle of the ferns as we crashed through them. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would burst. My lungs were on fire. I expected at any second to feel a massive hairy hand clamp down on my shoulder, to hear that roar right behind my ear. We burst out of the tree line into the main parking lot. The bright sunlight was blinding after the dimness of the forest. There were people here, a family loading a kayak onto their car, a couple putting on hiking boots, normal people having a normal day. They looked at us like we were insane, two half-naked guys, dripping wet, shaking, our eyes wide with a terror they couldn't possibly understand. We didn't stop. We just ran straight for my car, a beat-up old sedan parked at the far end of the lot. My hands were so wet and shaky, I dropped the keys twice before I could get the door unlocked. We scrambled inside, my cousin practically diving into the passenger seat. I slammed the door shut and hit the lock button. The thunk of the locks engaging was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I sat there for a second, just gripping the steering wheel, my whole body trembling uncontrollably. I was cold, but I was also sweating. I looked over at my cousin. He had his arms wrapped around himself, and he was just rocking back and forth in his seat, his face pale and tear-streaked. "Go," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Just go, man, please." I fumbled the key into the ignition and started the car. The engine roared to life, a comforting human sound. As I backed out of the parking spot, my eyes were drawn to the trailhead we'd just exploded out of, and it was there. It was standing at the edge of the trees, right where the path met the parking lot. It wasn't hiding, it was just standing there watching. The sun hit it fully now, and I could see the color of its hair more clearly, a deep reddish brown. It was even bigger than I'd thought. It must have been 8 feet tall, easy. Its massive chest rose and fell slowly. It didn't make a move towards the parking lot. It didn't roar again. It just stood there like a sentinel, a guard. Its dark eyes were fixed on my car, on me. It felt like a message. It wasn't chasing us. It was letting us go. It was showing us that it could have followed. It could have caught us in the woods if it wanted to. It was letting us know that we were leaving only because it allowed it. I stomped on the gas, the tires kicking up gravel. I didn't look in the rear-view mirror until we were out on the main road, the lake disappearing behind a curtain of trees. My cousin and I didn't speak the whole 2-hour drive home. We just sat in silence, wrapped in our own private horror, the smell of that thing still faintly clinging to our skin and hair. I've never been back to Lake Crescent. I don't go camping anymore. I get nervous if I have to stop for gas in a wooded area after dark. That one hot August day completely rewired my brain. I used to love the woods, the mystery of them. Now I just feel the fear. I know what's in there. I saw it. And I know with a certainty that sits like a stone in my stomach that it saw me too, and that it could have killed me without even trying. Story 10. Okay, so I've never posted anything like this before, but I need to get this out there. I don't really know who to tell, or if anyone would even believe me, but it's been eating at me for weeks now, and I can't stop thinking about it. It happened on my family's property up in Marinette County, Wisconsin. We've got a decent chunk of land there, mostly woods and some old trails, and I go up there sometimes in the winter to just get away from everything. It's quiet, you know, or it's supposed to be. This was back in late January, one of those days where the sky is just a flat, dull gray from morning to night, and the cold isn't the sharp, clean kind, but a damp, seeping cold that gets right into your bones. I'd been staying at the old cabin for a couple of days, just me, some books, and a wood stove. That morning, I decided to take a walk. We'd had a fresh snowfall overnight, maybe 3 or 4 inches, enough to cover everything in a clean white blanket. It was peaceful, silent. The only sound was the crunch of my own boots and my breath fogging in the air. I was following one of the main trails that loops around the back of the property, not really going anywhere, just walking. I'd probably been out for about 20 minutes when I saw them. At first, I thought they were just weird deer tracks, or maybe a moose had wandered through, which is rare, but not impossible. But as I got closer, I stopped dead in my tracks. My brain just sort of stalled out. They weren't deer tracks. They weren't moose tracks. They were footprints, bipedal, something walking on 2 legs. But they were massive. I mean, I'm 6 feet tall, and my own boot print looked like a kid's next to these things. The stride was what got me first. The distance between one print and the next was enormous. I remember taking a step from one of my prints to the next, a normal walking step, and then trying to span the distance between these things. I had to practically leap to get from one to the other. It was unnerving. This thing had a gait longer than any human I've ever known. My heart started beating a little faster, a dull thud in my chest that felt too loud for the quiet woods. I looked around, but there was nothing, just the trees, the snow, and this absolute silence. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing in on you. I'm not a superstitious person. I've spent my whole life in these woods. I've tracked deer, coyote, black bear, you name it. I know what animal sign looks like. This wasn't it. This was something else. The prints were deep, sunk way down into the snow, way deeper than my own. Whatever made them was heavy. Really, really heavy. I stood there for a minute just staring at them, this line of huge purposeful prints leading off into the trees. My first thought, my rational thought, was that it was a hoax. Some kids with a big wooden stamp or something, but I was a good 1.5 miles from the nearest road, and the snow was pristine aside from these tracks and my own. There were no other human prints, no signs of anyone else, and the tracks didn't look stamped. They looked organic. You could see the texture of the sole, if it was a sole. It was more like a pattern of lines and creases like a foot, but not a human foot. I pulled out my phone. The service is spotty out there, but the camera works fine. I started taking pictures. I knew nobody would believe me without pictures. I put my boot right next to one of the prints for scale. My size 11 boot looked like a toy. The print was easily half again as long and wider, much wider. The toes, if they were toes, were indistinct, but the whole impression was just huge. Then I remembered I had a collapsible yardstick in my backpack. I use it for measuring firewood sometimes. It's 3 feet long when it's extended. My hands were shaking a little from the cold, or maybe from something else, as I fumbled it out and snapped it open. I laid it down carefully next to the print. The print was longer than the yardstick. I'm not kidding. It was longer than 3 feet. I measured it twice, my breath catching in my throat. I laid my boot at the heel end of the print, and the yardstick went from the toe of my boot to well past the top of the print. It had to be at least 3.5 feet long, maybe more. The depth was insane, too. I could have stuck my whole forearm into the hole it left in the snow. The snow was packed down hard at the bottom, like something with immense weight had stood there for a second. A cold feeling that had nothing to do with the January air started creeping up my spine. This wasn't a hoax. Nobody carries a 3.5-foot-long fake foot a mile into the woods just to mess with someone. And the stride. I looked ahead, following the line of tracks. They went in a straight line, perfectly spaced, like it was just taking a casual stroll through the woods, but each step was covering a distance I'd have to sprint to match. I decided to follow them. I don't know why. Curiosity, I guess. A sick, twisting kind of curiosity that was already starting to feel like a mistake. I kept my phone out, taking pictures and a little video, narrating under my breath just to have a record. Okay, I'm following these tracks now. They're heading east, away from the cabin. The stride is... It's unbelievable. I'm holding the yardstick up. You can see the distance. The tracks led me off the main trail and into thicker woods. The trees were closer together here, mostly pine and hemlock, their branches weighed down with snow. The tracks didn't deviate. They went straight through, under low-hanging branches that this thing would have had to duck under, or maybe just push through. I had to duck. I remember the snow from a branch falling down the back of my neck, icy and shocking, and I jumped like I'd been shot. My nerves were completely on edge now. Every little sound, the creak of a tree, the plop of snow falling, made my heart hammer. I was sweating inside my coat despite the cold. The silence was the worst part. The woods are never completely silent. There's always a bird, a squirrel, the wind, But here, there was nothing. It was a dead zone. I followed the tracks for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 20 minutes. They led down a gentle slope towards a swampy area that's usually a mess of cattails and standing water in the summer, but was now just a flat, frozen white plain. The tracks came right out of that swamp. They emerged from the tree line on the far side, crossed the open frozen marsh, and started climbing the rise on my side. That was another detail that stuck with me. They came from the swamp. Who or what walks through a frozen swamp in the middle of winter? The water underneath would be bitterly cold. The ice maybe not fully trustworthy, but these tracks came straight across like it was nothing. I kept following them up the rise. The ground gets higher there, and there's an old abandoned cabin my granddad built decades ago. It's mostly used for storage now, full of rusty tools and old furniture. The tracks went right past it, not to it, past it, and they passed within what I'd guess was 20 yards of the front door. I stopped walking. I looked from the tracks to the cabin and back again. This thing had walked a path that took it within spitting distance of a man-made structure. It felt purposeful. It wasn't just an animal wandering randomly. It was moving with intent. It knew where it was going. That's when the real terror started to set in. It wasn't just a feeling of weirdness anymore. It was a deep, primal fear, the kind that sits in the pit of your stomach like a stone. I could feel the size of this thing in the silence, in the impossible stride, in the depth of those prints. I could feel its presence, like the air itself was thicker where it had walked. I felt small, insignificant like prey. I forced myself to keep moving, to keep documenting. My voice on the video is shaky, a half whisper. It passed right by the cabin. You can see the prints here. The snow is packed down so hard, no human could do this. The weight, you can just see the weight. I bent down to look at one of the prints near the cabin. The way the snow was compressed was different from how a boot packs snow. A boot sort of shoves the snow forward and down. This was just a perfect deep impression, with very little push-up at the edges. It was like something had been gently but firmly pressed into the snow with incredible force. I reached out a gloved hand and touched the packed snow at the bottom of the print. It was hard as a rock, solid ice. I stood up too fast, my head swimming a little. I looked around, my eyes scanning the trees, the shadows between the pines. Everything was still, too still. The feeling of being watched was so intense, it was almost a physical pressure. My skin was crawling. Every hair on my arms and the back of my neck was standing up. I was holding my breath without realizing it. The tracks continued on past the cabin, heading towards a particularly dense thicket of brush and young balsam firs. It was a mess of tangled branches and thorns, a place I'd never even tried to go through. The tracks led right up to the edge of it, and then they stopped. Well, they didn't stop. They went into the thicket, but there was no way I could follow. The brush was too thick, the branches woven together like a wall. I stood there at the edge, peering into the gloom under the trees. I couldn't see more than a few feet in. The tracks just vanished into that darkness. I didn't go any further. I couldn't. It was like hitting an invisible wall. My courage, or my stupidity, just ran out. I stood there for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, just staring into that thicket, listening. I was praying for a sound, for a snap of a twig, for anything that would tell me what I was dealing with. But there was nothing, just that heavy, oppressive silence. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation. A bear walking on its hind legs. No bear has a stride that long or leaves a print that size. A person on snowshoes. The prints didn't look like any snowshoe I'd ever seen, and the depth suggested a weight no human could have. A moose? They don't walk on 2 legs. I ran through every possibility, and every one of them fell apart. There was no explanation. None. I finally turned around and started walking back to my cabin. I didn't run, but I walked fast, my head on a swivel, looking back over my shoulder every few seconds. The walk back felt 10 times longer than the walk out. Every shadow looked like a moving shape. Every tree trunk seemed like it could be something else. I was jumpy, terrified, my heart pounding the whole way. When I got back to the cabin, I slammed the door shut and locked it, which was stupid because nobody else was around for miles. I sat by the wood stove, shivering, not from the cold, but from pure, undiluted fear. I looked at the pictures and the video on my phone. They were clear. They showed exactly what I'd seen. The huge prints, the impossible stride, the yardstick for scale. It was all there. I've tracked a lot of animals in my life. I've found bear dens, followed wolf packs, seen some pretty incredible things in nature, but nothing has ever gotten to me like this. It wasn't just the physical evidence, as shocking as that was. It was the feeling of something immense and powerful and utterly unknown moving through my backyard. It was the realization that there are things in these woods that I don't understand, things that don't fit into any box I have. The tracks were there in the snow. They were real. I saw them. I measured them. I felt the packed ice at the bottom of them. Something made those tracks. Something that walked on two legs, was incredibly heavy, had a stride longer than a human's, and moved with a purpose that felt intelligent. Something that came out of a frozen swamp and walked right past my door before disappearing into a wall of brush. I left the next morning. I couldn't stay. I haven't been back since. I look at the pictures sometimes, and I get that same cold feeling in my spine. I can't explain it. I can't rationalize it away. All I have is the evidence and the memory of that absolute gut-wrenching terror standing at the edge of the thicket, knowing that something was in there, or had been in there, and that I was completely and totally out of my depth. I've never felt so small, and I've never been so scared. I don't know what it was. I just know that it was real. Story 11. They drove us in this old Ford Falcon pickup truck that belonged to one of their dads. It was a beat-up thing, paint peeling off in patches, and the interior smelled like stale cigarettes and oil. The seats were cracked vinyl, and when you sat on them, you could feel the springs digging into your legs. I was small for my age, so I had to kind of perch on the edge of the passenger seat, my feet not quite touching the floor. They parked the truck at the end of our long driveway, where it curved away from the house and into a patch of woods. The plan was for them to sneak up to the house, grab some snacks and come back. And I was supposed to stay put in the truck. They told me not to make any noise, not to draw attention, and if I saw anything, just to lay low. It was a full moon that night, which made everything feel even weirder. The moonlight was bright enough to cast shadows, but there was this thick fog rolling in from the fields, so everything had a hazy, dreamlike quality. I remember feeling bored at first, just sitting there, watching the fog swirl around the trees. The truck was old, so the windows were fogging up from my breath, and I had to wipe them with my sleeve to see out. I could hear the occasional rustle in the woods, probably just animals, but it made me jumpy. The older teens had been gone for what felt like forever, but it was probably only 20 minutes or so. Time drags when you're a kid alone in the dark. Then I started to notice this smell. At first, it was faint, like something rotten had been left out too long, but it got stronger real fast. It was overwhelming, like a dead animal mixed with wet dirt and something else I can't even describe, just foul. I wrinkled my nose and tried to roll up the window, but the handle was stiff, and it only went up part way. The smell seeped in anyway, making my stomach turn. I remember thinking maybe a raccoon had died nearby, but then I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Through the fog, I could make out this figure coming toward the truck. It was walking from the tree line, slow and steady, like it wasn't in any hurry. My heart started pounding right away, because even from a distance I could tell it was huge. I mean, massive. As it got closer, I could see it was naked, covered in dark hair except for its face and the palms of its hands, which were pale and almost human-looking. but the rest of it was just shaggy, matted hair, like a bear's coat, but longer. It had to be over 7.5 feet tall, with shoulders so wide, I'd guess they were 3 feet across. Just enormous, like nothing I'd ever seen before. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but watch it get closer. The smell was so strong now that I was gagging, and I had to cover my mouth with my hand to keep from throwing up. Its face was kind of flat, with dark eyes that seemed to gleam in the moonlight, and it had this calm, curious expression, like it was just inspecting the truck, but that made it even scarier. It wasn't snarling or aggressive, just interested. I was trembling so hard my teeth were chattering, and I could feel cold sweat soaking through my shirt. It stopped maybe 10 feet from the truck, just standing there, looking at me through the windshield. I don't know how long we stayed like that, but it felt like hours. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Then, without even thinking, I reached for the steering wheel and hit the horn. It was a stupid move, I know, but I was panicking. The horn was loud and blaring in the quiet night, and the second it sounded, the thing reacted. It grabbed its ears with both hands like the noise was painful and let out this high-pitched scream that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a human scream. It was piercing, almost like a bird of prey, but deeper and more guttural. The sound echoed in the fog, and I could feel it vibrating in my chest. Then it slammed its hands down into the gravel on the ground, and I heard the crunch of rocks under its weight. It was so strong that the impact sent little pebbles flying against the truck's side. Before I could process what was happening, it moved toward the truck bed. It didn't run. It just kind of loped over. And in one fluid motion, it climbed into the bed. The whole truck shook when it landed, like something heavy had dropped in. I was still in the cab, gripping the seat so tight my knuckles were white. Then it started shaking the truck violently, rocking it back and forth. I was thrown around in my seat, my head banging against the window once, and I could hear the metal groaning like it was about to break apart. I was crying by then, tears streaming down my face, but I was too scared to make a sound. The shaking stopped for a second, and I saw this huge hand, palm bare and pale, fingers thick and hairy, slap against the windshield right in front of me. The glass didn't crack, but it made a loud thud that echoed in the cab. Then it leaned in close, its face pressing against the glass. Its breath fogged up the window, and I could see its eyes up close. They were dark, almost black, but with this weird intelligence in them. That calm expression never changed, like it was just studying me, and that was the most terrifying part. It wasn't angry. It was curious, and I felt like a bug under a microscope. I don't know what came over me, but I hit the horn again. My hand was shaking so bad I almost missed, but I managed to press it down. The blare cut through the night, and this time, the thing didn't scream. It just looked at me for a split second, then leaped off the truck bed. It jumped, cleared the distance to the trees in one bound, moving faster than anything that big should be able to. It disappeared into the fog, and the smell faded almost immediately, like it had never been there. A few seconds later, I heard voices. The older teens were coming back, laughing and carrying bags of chips and soda. They opened the driver's side door, and one of them said, "What's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost." I was shaking uncontrollably, my whole body trembling, and I couldn't speak. I just pointed toward the woods, but there was nothing there. They brushed it off, saying I must have fallen asleep and had a nightmare, but I knew what I saw. I spent the whole ride home in silence, curled up in the seat, and when we got back, I ran straight to my room and hid under the covers. I never told anyone the full story until now, because who would believe an 11-year-old kid? But that night changed me. I still get nightmares about it, and sometimes when there's a full moon and fog, I can't sleep because I remember that smell and those calm, curious eyes. I don't know what it was, a bear, some kind of animal or something else, but it felt intelligent and it felt real. And the way it just vanished, like it was never there, leaves me wondering to this day what would have happened if I hadn't hit that horn. Story 12. It was cold that night, the kind of cold that gets into your bones even with the heat on. I had the local news on the TV just for noise, and I was reading a book. It was a little after 9 o'clock. Then the dogs started. It wasn't the normal bark and grumble they do when a raccoon trips through the yard. This was different. It was a chorus from all down the street, a sharp, panicked, screaming kind of bark. My neighbor's German Shepherd Duke, he has a deep, serious bark, and he was going nuts. It was the sound that makes the back of your neck prickle. I put my book down and muted the TV. The silence in my house just made the barking outside seem louder, more frantic. I got up and went to the big picture window in my living room. It looks out over the front yard and the road. It was pitch black out, the kind of dark you only get in rural Oregon in November. No moon, no stars, just a blanket of cloud. I couldn't see anything at first, just the reflection of my own lamp in the glass. I cupped my hands around my eyes and leaned closer to the window, peering into the night. That's when I saw headlights coming down the highway from the west. A car, just one, its beams cutting 2 weak tunnels through the dark. And then, as the lights swept across the road about 130 feet from my house, they backlit something. My first thought, my brain's desperate, logical first try, was that it was a person. A really tall person in a big, dark coat, maybe a hunter. But that thought shattered in less than a second. The proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were way too broad, just impossibly wide, like a football player wearing massive shoulder pads. But this wasn't pads. This was its body. Its arms were long, I mean really long, hanging down past its waist, and they swung in a heavy pendulum rhythm as it walked. It was crossing the road from the forest on the south side toward the thicker woods on the north. And it was tall. I'm 6 feet even, and this thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. There was no neck that I could see. Its head seemed to sit directly on those monstrous shoulders. The whole body was covered in what looked like dark, coarse hair. Not fur like a bear, but hair. Thick, matted-looking hair. But the thing that really froze the air in my lungs was how it moved. It wasn't clumsy. It wasn't a lurch or a shuffle. It moved with this smooth, powerful, efficient grace. It covered the entire width of the 2-lane road in 3 strides. 3. I remember counting them in my head, my mind just clinging to that stupid, simple fact as everything else was falling apart. 1, 2, 3. Each step was long and deliberate, and it moved with a purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going and didn't have a second to waste. Just as it was about to step off the asphalt and into the ditch on the north side, the car got closer. The headlights must have hit it directly because it turned its head. It glanced back over its shoulder toward the car, and in that split second I saw its eyes. They reflected the light, not like a cat's eyes, all bright and green, but a dull, muddy amber color. 2 flat, glowing discs in the shadow of its face. There was no feeling in that look, no surprise, no fear, no aggression. It was just a look, a glance, and then it was gone. It took one more step and just melted into the tree line. It didn't crash through the brush, it was just absorbed by the darkness. The car, an old sedan I think, slowed down. It didn't slam on its brakes, but it slowed way down, almost to a crawl, right in the spot where the thing had been. It stopped for a few seconds. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. That driver saw it. I wasn't crazy. Someone else had seen it too. The car then sped up again, a little faster than before, and continued on its way east, its taillights shrinking into 2 red pinpricks and then vanishing. I stood at that window for a full minute, maybe more, just staring at the empty spot on the road. The image was burned into my eyes. That silhouette backlit by headlights, a massive, impossible shape that walked like a man but wasn't a man. My hands were shaking. I felt cold, a deep internal cold that had nothing to do with the November air. A crazy, reckless thought entered my head. I had to go out there. I had to see. I don't know why. It was the stupidest impulse I've ever had in my life, but it was overpowering. I couldn't just stand in my living room and pretend this didn't happen. I had to have some kind of proof for myself. I pulled on my heavy coat and my work boots, my fingers fumbling with the laces. I grabbed the big Maglite flashlight from by the door. It's heavy, metal, the kind you could use as a weapon if you had to. The thought crossed my mind, and it didn't make me feel any better. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air hit me like a slap, and then the smell hit me. It was foul. It was a thick, musky odor, like a wet animal hide that's been left to rot. It smelled like a damp dog, but mixed with something else, something earthy and decayed, like old compost and bog water. It was strongest near the edge of my property, right where the tree line started. The smell was so strong, it made my eyes water a little, and I felt a gag reflex in the back of my throat. It wasn't a scent that was just carried on the wind. It felt like it was hanging in the air, a solid, physical presence. The dogs were still barking, but it was different now. It was more of a worried, confused barking, mixed with whines. They could smell it too. They knew. I clicked on the flashlight. The beam was a solid white shaft in the darkness, and it just made everything outside of its circle seem blacker. I walked across my lawn, my boots crunching on the frozen grass. My heart was still going 1,000,000 miles an hour, and every shadow looked like it was moving. I was terrified. Every part of my body was screaming at me to go back inside, lock the door and hide. But I kept walking toward the road. I stood on the shoulder, right where I'd seen it. I shone the light across the asphalt. Nothing, no marks, no scuffs. It had crossed there, but it hadn't left a trace on the road. I turned the beam toward the ditch and the tree line on the north side, where it had disappeared. I moved slowly, my breath puffing out in white clouds. The undergrowth was thick there, ferns and salal and young hemlocks, and I saw it. The vegetation was pressed down, not just trampled, but pressed, like something very heavy had walked through it. There was a path, a kind of tunnel through the ferns, about 3 feet wide. I could see broken branches on a salmonberry bush, snapped at about chest height for me, way higher than a deer would break them. I took a few steps closer, shining the light at the ground. The forest floor was a mess of fallen leaves, fir needles, and moss. I got down on one knee, ignoring the damp seeping through my jeans, and swept the leaves aside with my hand. The ground beneath was soft, and there, in the mud, was an impression. It wasn't a clear footprint, not like you see in the movies with perfect toes. It was just a deep, vague depression, long and broad. It was huge, way bigger than my own boot. The shape was all messed up by the leaves and debris, but the size was undeniable. This wasn't a bear track. A bear's back foot looks like a human footprint, but this was different. It was just a massive, heavy impression. As I was kneeling there, the dogs stopped barking. It didn't taper off. It just stopped, all of them at once. 1 second the night was full of their noise, and the next it was silent. Completely, utterly silent. No wind, no rustle of leaves, no distant hum from the highway. It was a dead, heavy silence, the kind that feels like a physical weight pressing down on your ears. It was more unnerving than the barking had been. I stood up so fast I got a head rush. I shone the flashlight beam into the woods, sweeping it back and forth. The beam of light just seemed to get swallowed by the trees after 20 feet. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. I felt like I was being watched. It was a primal feeling, a cold trickle down my spine. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up. My skin was crawling. The smell was still there, that awful musky stench. It felt like it was all around me now. I backed away. I didn't turn my back on the woods. I just walked backwards, step by careful step, my flashlight beam jittering across the tree line. I didn't run until my heels hit the asphalt of the road. Then I turned and half walked, half jogged back to my house, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I fumbled with the doorknob, my hand still shaking violently, finally got it open and slammed the door behind me, throwing the deadbolt. I stood there in my hallway, my back against the door, listening. The house was silent. The TV was still on, muted, showing a weather map. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I went around the house and checked every lock on every door and window. I closed all the blinds. I kept the mag light in my hand. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair in my living room in the dark, just listening. Every creak of the house, every pop from the fireplace made me jump. The whole encounter, from the first bark to me slamming my door, probably lasted less than 5 minutes. But it changed everything. That image, that backlit figure with its wide shoulders and swinging arms and those dull amber eyes, is seared into my brain. The memory of that smell still comes back to me sometimes, out of nowhere, and I'll feel that same cold dread. I used to love the woods. I liked hiking, camping. Now I don't even like looking out my back window at night. The forest doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels occupied. It feels like there's something out there that doesn't belong in any field guide, something that moves with a grace that shouldn't be possible for something that size, something that watches from the shadows. And I know, with a certainty that sits like a stone in my gut, that what I saw was a Sasquatch. I didn't believe in them before. Not really. I thought they were just stories. But I believe now. And that belief comes with a deep-seated terror that I don't think will ever go away. I saw it cross the road in 3 steps, and my world got a whole lot bigger and a whole lot scarier. I still don't know what to do with that. Story 13. It was one of those summers that felt like it would never end. The kind where the heat just sits on you, heavy and wet, making your t-shirt stick to your back before you even step out the door. This was back in 1978. I must have been 11 years old. My brother was a year younger, and our neighbor from down the road, a kid we just hung out with because he was there, was the same age as me. We didn't have video games or 100 channels to watch. Our whole world was the woods and the fields behind our houses near Barnwell. That particular day, the air was so thick you could almost chew it. We'd been kicked out of the house after lunch, our mum telling us not to come back until we were good and dirty. We started off messing around in the creek, skipping flat stones until we got bored, and then my brother had the brilliant idea to go down to the old railroad line. It wasn't used anymore. The tracks were all rusty and the wooden ties were rotting, with weeds growing up tall between them. It was our place, our secret world. We'd walk the rails, seeing who could balance the longest, or we'd put pennies on the track, pretending a train might still come, and smash them flat. We were just trudging along, the crushed rock between the ties crunching under our sneakers. I remember the smell, that hot, dusty smell of iron and creosote from the old wood. The sun was beating down, and the only sounds were the cicadas buzzing in the trees and our own stupid jokes. We were arguing about something pointless, probably who was the fastest runner, when everything just stopped. The cicadas went silent, all at once. It was like someone had thrown a switch. We all noticed it and just stood there for a second looking at each other. The woods got real quiet, the kind of quiet that feels wrong, that presses in on your ears. And then we heard it. It wasn't a growl, it wasn't a roar, it was a screech, a high-pitched, tearing sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It didn't sound like any animal I knew, not a bobcat, not a fox, nothing. It was sharp, and it felt like it went right through my skull. I felt my skin go tight and cold all over, even in that heat. My brother's eyes got huge, and the neighbor kid just froze, his mouth hanging open. "What was that?" my brother whispered, his voice all shaky. I didn't have an answer. We all just stood there listening. The woods were still dead quiet. For a few seconds there was nothing, then we heard it again, closer this time. It was a shorter sound, more like a sharp, questioning shriek. It came from further down the track, around a bend where the trees grew thick and close to the rails. We should have run. Any sane person would have just turned and bolted for home. But we were kids. And that stupid curiosity, that feeling of being invincible that you only have when you're that age, it got the better of us. We had to see, we had to know. Let's just go take a peek, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. My heart was already hammering against my ribs. We started walking, but it was different now. We weren't laughing or shoving each other. We walked slow, careful, trying not to make any noise on the gravel. Every little crunch our feet made sounded like a gunshot in that silence. The air felt even heavier, like it was pushing down on us. I could feel the sweat trickling down my spine, but it was a cold sweat. We crept around the bend, staying low, using the big, leafy ferns that grew along the edge of the woods for cover. The track straightened out again into a short clearing before disappearing into another thick patch of trees. And that's where we saw it. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. I thought it was a bear. Maybe a weird, skinny bear standing up on its hind legs, but it wasn't. It was tall. So incredibly tall. It had to be at least 7 feet, maybe more. It was standing right next to the tracks, half turned away from us, looking off into the woods on the other side. Its body was covered in hair, but it wasn't shaggy like a bear's. It was dark brown, almost black in places, and it looked thick, like a wiry coat. Its arms were ridiculously long, hanging down past its knees. They were massive, with huge hands that just hung at its sides. Its legs were thick, like tree trunks. Then it turned its head. It wasn't fast. It was slow, deliberate, like it had just heard us, or smelled us, and we saw its face. That's the part that's burned into my brain. That face, it was both human and not human at all. It had a heavy brow ridge, and its eyes were deep set and dark. Its nose was flat, wider than a human's, and its mouth, I don't know. It wasn't snarling, it just looked there. The skin on its face was dark, leathery looking, and mostly hairless except around the jawline. It looked at us, and its eyes. They weren't dumb animal eyes. There was something in them, a kind of intelligence, a awareness that froze the blood in my veins. It seemed just as startled as we were. Its body went still, and it just stared right at us. We stared back. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was like my feet were nailed to the ground. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears, a loud, frantic drumbeat. I could feel my brother trembling next to me, his whole body shaking. I could smell the sharp, sour smell of the neighbor kid's fear. We were all paralyzed. That moment felt like it lasted forever. It was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, but it stretched out into an eternity. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. I was just locked in place, staring at this thing, and it was staring right back at me. I could see the way the sunlight caught the individual hairs on its massive shoulders. I could see the way its chest moved as it breathed, slow and steady, unlike our own ragged, panicked breaths. I could see the sheer raw power in its frame. It could have torn us apart without even trying. It didn't make a move toward us. It didn't roar or beat its chest. It just stood there watching us, and the sheer size of it, the sheer presence of it, filled the whole clearing with a kind of primal terror. This wasn't a story. This wasn't a movie monster. This was real, standing right there, close enough that I could have thrown a rock and hit it. Then something broke. Maybe it was a twig snapping under my brother's foot, or maybe the neighbor kid let out a whimper. I don't know, but the spell shattered. A sound came out of my throat, a kind of choked gasp that turned into a scream I didn't even recognize as my own. It was a raw, terrified scream that ripped out of me from somewhere deep down, a place I didn't know existed. At the exact same instant, my brother and the neighbor kid screamed too. It was a chorus of pure, undiluted panic. We spun around so fast we almost fell over, and then we ran. I have never run like that in my life, before or since. It wasn't running. It was a frantic, blind scramble for survival. My legs felt like jelly, but they pumped harder than they ever had. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, following the railroad ties back the way we came, my lungs burning, my throat raw from screaming. I could hear my brother sobbing and gasping for air right behind me, and the neighbor kid was just wailing, a high-pitched, continuous sound of terror. The world narrowed down to the rusty track in front of my feet. Crunch, crunch, crunch on the gravel. The ferns and branches whipped at my arms and face, stinging, but I didn't feel any pain. All I felt was this crushing, overwhelming need to get away, to get behind a door, to get to safety. My vision started to tunnel, everything at the edges going dark and blurry. All I could see was the path home. We burst out of the tree line into the field behind our houses. The house looked a million miles away. We kept running, our legs screaming in protest, our chests heaving. We didn't stop. We just ran straight across that field, through my mum's vegetable garden, trampling her tomato plants without a second thought. We hit the back porch steps in a tangled heap, all three of us trying to get through the screen door at once. I remember the sound of the spring on the door, straining, that high-pitched, spruing sound as we shoved our way through. Then the glass door. We didn't even try the handle. We just slammed into it, a mess of arms and legs and sheer terror. I thought for sure we were going to crash right through it. The whole frame shook, and the glass rattled violently. I fumbled for the handle, my hands slick with sweat, my fingers clumsy and numb. I finally got it open, and we all fell into the kitchen, collapsing on the linoleum floor in a heap. We were gasping, crying, unable to form words. My mum came running in from the living room, her face a mask of shock and confusion. "What in the world is wrong with you boys? You're going to break the door down." We just lay there on the floor, sobbing, trying to catch our breath. We couldn't speak. How could we possibly explain what we had seen? It sounded insane, even in my own head, a giant hairy man-thing in the woods. She'd think we'd been in the sun too long. We eventually calmed down enough to mutter something about seeing a big snake, the biggest snake we'd ever seen. It was the first stupid lie that came to mind. She scolded us for being so reckless and making such a fuss, and that was that. We didn't talk about it. Not to her, not to our dad, and not to each other. Not for a long, long time. The neighbor kid went home, pale and quiet, and he didn't come back to our house for over a month. I'd see him outside sometimes, and we'd just look at each other from a distance, and then look away. There was an understanding between us, a shared secret that was too big and too scary to put into words. Years later, when we were all in our late teens, we finally talked about it. We were sitting around a campfire, and someone brought up weird childhood memories. There was a long, heavy silence. Then my brother said, "You remember that thing by the railroad tracks?" And we all did. We described it separately without prompting. The height, the long arms, the dark hair, the face that was almost human, the way it just stood there, looking at us, the way it didn't chase us. Our stories matched, down to the smallest, most terrifying detail. That's when I knew for sure it was real. We hadn't imagined it. We hadn't made it up. It left me with a feeling I've never been able to shake. It's not just the fear, though, God knows that's part of it. It's the wonder, the sheer, baffling wonder of it all. What was it? Where did it come from? Why was it there? We were just three kids playing by some old train tracks on a hot summer day, and for 15 seconds our world cracked open and showed us something we were never supposed to see, something that should not exist, and then it closed again, leaving us with a memory that feels more like a ghost, a permanent chill in the back of my mind that never, ever goes away. I still don't know what we saw that day. I just know that we saw it. Turn to Story 14. All right, I've never shared this with anyone outside my family, and even then, we don't talk about it much. But it's been eating at me for years, and I guess writing it down might help. or maybe it'll just make it feel real all over again. Either way, here goes. This happened back in the summer of 1974 in Sandy, Oregon. I was just a kid then, maybe 10 or 11 years old, and my brother was a couple years younger. We lived in a trailer park on the edge of town, right up against Tickle Creek Woods. Those woods were our whole world back then, dense, dark in places, but mostly just this huge playground where we could disappear for hours. Our parents didn't mind, as long as we were back before dark, so we spent almost every day out there. We had this tree platform we'd built ourselves with scraps of wood and some rusty nails we found. It wasn't much, just a few planks nailed between two sturdy branches about 15 feet up in an old pine tree. But to us, it was a fortress. It overlooked a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, where the trees thinned out and you could see a good chunk of the forest floor. The ground was always covered in a thick layer of pine needles, soft and silent underfoot, which made it easy to sneak around without making noise. That day, like most days, we'd been up there since morning, just messing around, pretending we were explorers or soldiers or whatever. It was around noon when things got weird. The sun was high, casting dappled light through the trees, and it was warm, but not too hot. I remember the smell, that mix of pine, damp earth, and something else, something wild that always hung in the air out there. I was sitting on the edge of the platform, legs dangling, while my brother was fiddling with a stick he'd carved into a makeshift knife. We weren't talking much. It was one of those lazy days where you just enjoy being outside. I was scanning the clearing, my eyes drifting over the stumps and bushes, when I saw movement behind a big moss-covered stump off to the left. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a bear. We had those around sometimes, but then it stepped out a little, and my breath caught in my throat. This thing was tall, way taller than any man I'd ever seen, and covered in light brown hair that looked almost golden in the sun. It had to be over 7 feet tall, with shoulders that were broad and powerful looking. Its face, God, I'll never forget its face. It had a broad, flat nose and deep-set eyes that seemed dark and intelligent. The hair on its face was short and even, not shaggy like the rest of it, and for a second it felt like it was looking right at me. It moved behind that stump with this silent grace that didn't make sense for something so big. There was no sound, no crackling twigs, no rustling leaves, nothing. It just glided, like it was part of the forest itself. One moment it was there, and the next it vanished into the brush on the other side of the clearing. I sat there frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst out. I couldn't speak, couldn't even move my eyes away from where it had been. My brother must have noticed because he nudged me and whispered, "What's wrong?" I just shook my head, still staring, and when I finally managed to point, there was nothing there. I tried to describe it to him, but the words came out all jumbled. Big, hairy, tall. He didn't see it, so he just shrugged and went back to his stick. But I couldn't shake the feeling. My skin was crawling, and I kept scanning the trees, half expecting it to reappear. The rest of the afternoon dragged on, and every little sound, a bird chirping, a squirrel scrambling, made me jump. I felt exposed up on that platform, like we were being watched, but I didn't say anything, because I didn't want to scare my brother or sound crazy. As the day wore on, the light started to fade, and dusk settled in. The woods got quieter, the way they do when night is coming, and the air grew cooler. We were still on the platform, mostly because I was too uneasy to suggest leaving, and my brother was content to stay until the last possible minute. The shadows lengthened, turning the clearing into a patchwork of dark and light, and that's when I felt it, this prickle on the back of my neck, like someone was staring right at me. I turned slowly, my heart starting to race again, and that's when I saw it. Behind us, maybe 20 feet away, stood a dark silhouette against the deepening twilight. It was tall and broad, just like the thing I'd seen earlier, But now it was just a shadowy shape, motionless and silent. It was watching us. I could feel it in my bones. Its eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light, and I knew it was the same creature. My brother saw it too this time. I heard his sharp intake of breath, and then he grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I was too scared to think, too scared to move. For what felt like forever, we just stared at each other, us and it, and the forest was so quiet I could hear my own blood pounding in my ears. Then, without a sound, it took a step closer, and that's when panic seized me. I scrambled to my feet, pulling my brother with me, and we half climbed, half fell down the tree. I don't even remember how we got down. It was a blur of scraping bark and frantic movements. Once we hit the ground, we didn't look back. We just ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise or the branches whipping at our faces. All I could think was, get to the trailer park, get to safety. We burst out of the woods and didn't stop until we were back at our trailer, panting and sweating, our clothes torn and dirty. My mom asked what happened, and we just said we saw a bear, because what else could we say? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that silhouette, those deep-set eyes, and I'd jolt awake, my heart racing all over again. The thing is, that wasn't the end of it. 2 years later, when I was 12 or 13, I had to go back to those woods. I'd left something up on the platform, a pocket knife my dad had given me, and I'd been too scared to retrieve it until then. It was a stupid idea, but I waited until midnight, thinking the darkness would hide me. The woods were different at night, alive with sounds I didn't recognize, and the air was thick with the smell of damp and decay. I had a flashlight, but its beam felt weak, like it was just pushing back the shadows instead of lighting the way. I made my way to the creek, my footsteps cautious on the needle-covered ground. It was so quiet, too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I was almost to the tree when I heard it. Heavy footsteps, coming from the direction of the creek. They weren't human. They were too slow, too deliberate, and each step made a soft, squelching sound, like something big walking through wet mud. I froze, my flashlight beam shaking in my hand, and pointed it toward the sound. That's when I heard the breathing, deep, wet, like someone with a cold, but louder, much louder. It was close, so close I could almost feel the warmth of it. Then came a grunt, low and guttural, and I felt it vibrate through the ground, up through my feet and into my bones. It was right there, maybe just a few feet away in the darkness. My hand started shaking so bad I dropped the flashlight, and it hit the ground with a thud, the beam flickering and then going out. In that moment, pure terror took over. I didn't think, I just ran, stumbling through the dark, branches scraping my face and arms, not caring if I fell or got lost. I didn't stop until I was back at the trailer park, collapsed on the steps, gasping for air. We never found any tracks. The ground was too covered in needles, but I know what I saw, what I heard. That thing was real, and it was there in those woods, aware of us but not aggressive, just watching. It moved with this silent grace that still gives me chills when I think about it. To this day, I can't go into those woods without feeling that same fear, like something is just out of sight, waiting. I don't know what it was, but I'm sure it belonged there. A hidden giant that I narrowly faced more than once, and it changed how I see the forest forever. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I still hear those footsteps and that breathing, and I know I'll never forget it. Story 15. I still can't believe I'm typing this out. It feels like my hands are shaking just thinking about it, and it's been months now. But I need to get this down, because keeping it bottled up is driving me crazy. Maybe putting it out there will help, or maybe someone else has gone through something similar. I don't know. All I know is that what happened that day changed everything for me and Jean. We moved to this place in rural Idaho about 6 months ago. It was supposed to be our dream home, quiet, surrounded by woods, with no neighbors for miles. We'd saved up for years, and when we finally got the keys, we were over the moon. The first few weeks were perfect, waking up to the sound of birds, the smell of pine in the air, that kind of thing. But then stuff started going missing. It was little things at first. A case of water from the garage. I thought maybe I'd misplaced it or Jean had moved it, but then it was a bag of frozen strawberries from the freezer out back, and then a pack of wieners. Weird, right? I mean, who steals frozen strawberries? Then one day, a whole roll of burlap we had for gardening just vanished. That's when we started to get uneasy. It wasn't like animals could carry off a burlap roll that easily. We mentioned it to the guy at the local sporting goods store when we went in to pick up some ammo. He's been in this area his whole life, and he just looked at us real serious and said, "You folks knew out there by the old Miller place." We nodded, and he leaned in close. "You might want to be careful. There's stories about Sasquatch around here. They like to take things. Food, supplies, I've heard it from others." Jean and I laughed it off at first. Bigfoot, come on. But the guy wasn't smiling, and that stuck with us. A couple of days later, we woke up to find footprints in the mud near our shed. Jean wears size 12 shoes, and these prints were way bigger, I mean huge. Like if you put Jean's boot next to one, it looked like a kid's shoe. The toes were long, and the shape was human-like, but not quite. It sent a chill down my spine. We took pictures, but they didn't do it justice. That's when we decided we had to do something. We couldn't just ignore it anymore. So that morning, the day everything went down, we got up early. The sun was just starting to come up, casting this pale light through the trees. It was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, and I remember pulling on my thick jacket and feeling the weight of it. Jean loaded up his 9mm pistol, and I had my own little revolver. We didn't know what we were walking into, but we weren't going unprepared. We started from where the footprints were, right by the shed. The ground was soft from rain the night before, so the tracks were clear. They led off into the forest behind our property. The woods here are dense, mostly pine trees that tower over you, blocking out a lot of the light. It's beautiful, but that day it felt ominous, like the trees were watching us. We followed the tracks for what felt like hours. My heart was pounding the whole time, and I could hear my own breathing too loud in the quiet. Every little sound, a twig snapping, a bird calling, made me jump. Jean was ahead of me, his footsteps steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He kept his pistol out, held low but ready. The tracks were easy to follow at first, but then they got tricky. We'd be following a clear set, and suddenly they'd seem to double back or disappear. At one point, we realized the thing had been walking backwards in places, like it was trying to confuse anyone tracking it. That freaked me out. I mean, how smart is that? It wasn't just some dumb animal, it was thinking, planning. We pushed deeper into the forest, the air getting colder and damper. The smell of wet earth and pine needles was strong, and I could feel the dampness seeping through my boots. My fingers were numb from clutching my revolver so tight. We came to a grove of massive pine trees, their trunks so wide I couldn't wrap my arms around them. The ground was covered in a thick layer of needles, and the tracks seemed to fade here. We stopped, listening. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, a rock came flying from the hillside to our left. It wasn't a small rock, it was big, maybe the size of a football, and it whizzed past our heads so close I felt the air move. It smashed into a tree behind us with a loud crack. I screamed. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Jean spun around, his eyes wide with panic, and he fired his 9mm into a dirt bank nearby. The sound was deafening in the silence, echoing through the trees. For a second, everything was still. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the brush. Something big and shaggy, covered in dark hair, moving fast. It was tall, way taller than a man, and it disappeared into the trees before I could get a good look, but I saw enough to know it wasn't a bear. Bears don't move like that, and they don't have that kind of shape. This thing was upright, running on two legs, and it was gone in a flash. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I could taste adrenaline, metallic and sharp in my mouth. Jean was breathing heavily, his hands shaking as he lowered his pistol. "Did you see that?" he whispered, and I just nodded, too scared to speak. We stood there for what felt like forever, just listening. The forest had gone dead quiet, like all the animals had fled. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It was eerie, like the whole world was holding its breath. We knew we had to get out of there, but we also needed to see where that thing had come from. Cautiously, we moved toward the hillside where the rock had been thrown. The ground was steep and rocky, and we had to climb a bit. My legs felt weak like jelly, and I kept slipping on the wet leaves. Jean helped me up, and his hand was cold and clammy. When we reached the spot, we found something that made my blood run cold. There, tucked between two large boulders, was a kind of campsite. It was hidden well, almost like a nest, and piled up inside were our missing things: the cases of water, the bag of frozen strawberries, now thawed and messy, the wieners, and the burlap roll. The burlap had been torn into strips and woven between the rocks to make a sort of shelter. It was crude, but it was deliberate. Someone or something had been living here, using our stuff. We just stared at it. I felt a mix of fear and disbelief. This wasn't random, it was intentional. This creature had been stealing from us and setting up a home out here. Why? Was it watching us? The thought made my skin crawl. We didn't touch anything. We just backed away slowly, not taking our eyes off the campsite. Jean grabbed my arm and we hurried back the way we came. The whole way, I kept expecting another rock to come flying or to see that shaggy figure again. Every shadow seemed to move and every sound made me flinch. By the time we got back to our house, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the yard. We locked the door behind us and just stood there, breathing hard. I remember my hands were trembling so much I could barely take off my jacket. Jean poured us both a stiff drink, and we sat at the kitchen table, not saying much. That was the day we realized we weren't alone out here. We've talked about it since, and we've decided to just leave it be. We don't go into that part of the woods anymore, and we keep our doors locked tight at night. Sometimes we even leave out a little food, some fruit or bread on the porch, just in case. It sounds crazy, I know, but after what we saw, it feels like the right thing to do. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, thinking I hear something outside. Jean does too. We never saw it again, not clearly, but we know it's out there, and I can't explain any of it. Not the footprints, not the rock, not the campsite. It's just this thing that happened, and now we have to live with it. I don't know if it's Sasquatch or something else, but it's real, and it scared me to my core. I guess that's all there is to say. I just needed to get it off my chest. Story 16. I've always been drawn to the woods and swamps around my grandparents' place in Louisiana. Even as a kid, I spent more time out there than anywhere else. It was like a second home to me. All those thick trees and muddy waters, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. I'd go out for hours just exploring, building little forts or sitting by the riverbank watching the water flow by. But there was always this weird feeling, like someone or something was watching me. I'd hear twigs snap behind me or rustling in the bushes, and I'd spin around, heart pounding, but there'd be nothing there. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a deer or a raccoon, and I'd shake it off and keep going. Over the years, I got used to it, almost like it was part of the landscape. Then, years later, in 1991, I found myself back in Louisiana. I'd moved away for work, but something pulled me back to that old camping spot near Jonesboro. It was a place I'd loved as a kid, where I'd spent countless nights under the stars with my family. I decided to go alone, just for a day, to relive some of those memories. I figured it'd be peaceful, a chance to clear my head. The day started early. I woke up before sunrise, packed my gear into my truck, a tent, some food, a flashlight, and not much else. The drive out there was familiar, all those winding roads through the pine forests, the humidity already clinging to everything even though it was still dark. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was just starting to peek over the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I parked near the edge of the woods, where the path to the camping area began. The air was thick and warm, filled with the buzz of insects and the distant croaking of frogs. I took a deep breath, feeling that old excitement mixed with a tinge of nervousness. It had been so long, but it all felt the same. I started hiking in, following the trail I remembered from childhood. It was overgrown in places, with vines and bushes crowding the path, but I could still make it out. The ground was soft under my boots, a mix of mud and fallen leaves. I walked slowly, taking it all in. The trees were tall and dense, blocking out most of the sunlight, so it felt like I was moving through a green tunnel. Every now and then, I'd stop to listen to the sounds around me, birds chirping, squirrels chattering, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then that old feeling came back, stronger than ever. It was like a weight on my chest, this sense that I wasn't alone. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the solitude playing tricks on me. As I got deeper into the woods, the sounds started to change. The normal forest noises seemed to fade, and I began hearing other things. Heavy footsteps crunching on branches, like something big was moving nearby. At first, I thought it might be a bear or a wild hog, something common out there. But the footsteps didn't sound right. They were too deliberate, too heavy, and they seemed to keep pace with me, stopping when I stopped, starting when I started. My heart started beating faster, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back, even though it wasn't that hot. I kept telling myself to stay calm, that it was probably nothing. After about an hour of hiking, I reached the clearing where I used to camp. It was a small, open area near the river, with a few old fire pits and logs scattered around. I dropped my backpack and decided to set up camp before exploring further. As I was unpacking my tent, I glanced toward the tree line, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a moss-covered stump or a fallen log. It was about 30 yards away, tucked between two big oaks, and it blended in perfectly with the surroundings. I didn't think much of it. My mind was on getting the tent up and maybe starting a fire later. But as I bent down to hammer in a stake, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked up, and the stump wasn't a stump anymore. It was standing up. My brain took a second to process what I was seeing. This thing was huge, way bigger than any person or animal I'd ever seen. It had to be over 9 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair that looked almost like moss or mud. Its arms were long and thick, hanging down past its knees, and its body was massive, like a bear but standing upright. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. It was just standing there, facing me, and I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them clearly in the shadows. Then, in an instant, it turned and sprinted toward the river. I've never seen anything move that fast. It wasn't running like a human or an animal. It was more like a blur, all power and speed. Its legs pumped, and it covered the distance to the riverbank in what felt like seconds. The river there is about 20 feet wide, with fast-moving water, but this thing didn't even slow down. It leapt, clearing the entire span in one jump, landing on the other side with a thud I could feel through the ground. Then it disappeared into the trees on the opposite bank. For a long moment, I just stood there, trembling. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the tent stake I was holding. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I felt cold all over, like I'd been dunked in ice water. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to run after it, to see if it was real, but the other part was screaming at me to get out of there. I forced myself to move, walking slowly toward the riverbank where it had jumped. My legs felt like jelly, and every step was an effort. When I reached the spot, I saw the tracks. They were in the soft mud near the water, and they were enormous. I wear size 11 boots, and these prints were way bigger, at least twice the size. They were deep, like whatever made them was heavy, and the shape was weird, long and wide, with what looked like toes splayed out. I knelt down to get a closer look, my hands still shaking. The ground was disturbed where it had squatted before taking off, and I could see the impression of its feet and hands, like it had been crouching there, watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't some animal I knew. This was something else entirely. I didn't waste any more time. I hurried back to my camp, my mind racing. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, not even bothering to fold the tent properly. I just shoved everything into my backpack and started hiking back to the truck. The whole way, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that thing again. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump, and I walked faster, almost running in places. The woods that had felt so familiar now seemed alien and threatening. The sounds that had been comforting earlier now felt like warnings. By the time I reached my truck, I was out of breath and soaked in sweat. I threw my gear in the back and got in, locking the doors immediately. I sat there for a few minutes, just breathing, trying to calm down. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel. I started the engine and drove away, not looking back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road. The whole drive I kept replaying what happened in my head, the way it stood up, the speed it moved, the size of those tracks. It felt like a nightmare, but I knew it was real. I never went back to that area, not once. Even now, years later, I still hike. But I stick to places in North Georgia, and I'm always extra cautious. I keep an eye on my surroundings, and I never go alone if I can help it. That day changed something in me. I used to love the woods for their peace, but now I know there are things out there that don't make sense, things that can scare you to your core. I've told a few people about it over the years, but most just shrug it off or say I saw a bear. But I know what I saw, and no bear moves like that or leaves tracks that big. I still don't have any answers, and I doubt I ever will. It's just one of those things that happened, and all I can do is live with it. Story 17. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because I'd just finished work for the day. I do remote IT stuff, so I'm home most of the time. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, maybe around 5 in the afternoon, and the air had that crisp, cold bite that comes with autumn here. I'd been sitting at my desk for hours, and my back was stiff, so I decided to step out onto the back porch for a minute just to stretch and breathe in the fresh air. I do that a lot. It's part of my routine. The porch is screened in, but I usually leave the door open if the weather's decent. And that day, it was clear, with a light frost already settling on the grass. I was standing there leaning against the railing when I heard something moving in the trees. At first, I didn't think much of it. Deer come through here all the time. We've got mule deer, elk, even the occasional bear, but they usually keep their distance. This sound was different, though. It wasn't the light rustling of a small animal or the cautious steps of a deer. It was heavier, like something big was pushing through the underbrush. I squinted into the tree line, which is about 30 yards from my porch, and the light was fading fast, so everything was cast in shadows. The trees are thick there, mostly spruce with low-hanging branches, so it's hard to see much beyond the first few feet. I remember feeling a little curious, maybe even annoyed, thinking it was probably a bear getting into the trash again. I'd had issues with that before, so I stayed put, watching. Then the movement stopped, and for a second, everything went quiet. Too quiet. The birds had stopped chirping, and the usual rustle of squirrels was gone. That's when I felt the first prickle of unease, like the air had gotten heavier. My heart started beating a little faster, and I straightened up, peering harder into the gloom. And then it stepped out from behind a spruce tree. I froze. Completely. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But they weren't. This thing was tall, I'd guess 7 or 8 feet, and it was covered in dark, matted hair from head to toe, It walked upright on two legs, not hunched over like a bear, but straight, almost human-like, but way too big to be a person. Its arms were long and swung slightly as it moved, and the hair on them was thick, like coarse fur. It didn't seem to be trying to hide or sneak around. It just emerged from behind the tree and stood there, right at the edge of the tree line, like it was surveying the area. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. At first I thought, maybe it's a guy in a costume or something, but who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere dressed like that? And the way it moved, it was smooth, natural, not clumsy like a person in a suit. Then it turned its head, and that's when we locked eyes. I'll never forget that moment. Its eyes were dark, almost black, and they seemed to gleam in the fading light. When our gazes met, a wave of pure, primal fear washed over me. It wasn't just scare, it was deeper than that. Like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to hide, that this thing was dangerous. I felt cold all over, and my hands started trembling so bad I had to grip the porch railing to steady myself. Time seemed to slow down. I couldn't look away, and it didn't either. It just stood there, staring right at me, and I felt like it was sizing me up, like I was prey. I've never been so terrified in my life. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, and my mouth went dry. I thought about shouting or making noise to scare it off, but I was too scared to even breathe loudly. Part of me was afraid that if I moved, it would charge or something. So I stayed perfectly still, barely blinking, and it did the same. We must have stayed like that for what felt like 20 seconds, but it could have been longer. It's hard to judge time when you're that scared. Then, without any warning, it shifted its weight. It didn't startle or run. It just turned its body slowly and started walking back into the woods. Its movements were calm, almost leisurely. Like it had all the time in the world. It didn't look back at me again. It just disappeared into the trees, and within seconds it was gone. The sound of its footsteps faded, and the forest went quiet again. But the silence felt heavier now, oppressive. I didn't move from that porch for what felt like hours. My legs were shaking, and I had to sit down on the steps because I thought I might pass out. The cold seeped through my jeans, but I barely noticed. I kept staring at the spot where it had been, half expecting it to come back. My mind was reeling. What the hell was that? A bear. No, bears don't walk upright like that for long, and they're not that tall. A person. Impossible. The height, the hair, the way it moved. I've spent enough time in the woods to know the local wildlife, and this was nothing I'd ever seen or heard of. As it got darker, the fear started to morph into something else, a deep, unsettling curiosity. I wanted to go check the area, to see if there was any evidence, but I was too scared. What if it was still out there, watching me? So I stayed put, huddled on the porch, listening to every little sound. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and each time I jumped, thinking it was coming back. My skin was crawling, and I kept feeling like I was being watched, even though I couldn't see anything. Eventually the cold got to me, and I forced myself to go inside. I locked the door behind me and checked all the windows, making sure everything was secure. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, had me bolting upright in bed. I kept replaying the encounter in my head. The way it looked, the way it stared at me, that primal fear stuck with me, like a chill I couldn't shake. The next morning, as soon as the sun was up, I mustered the courage to go back outside. The frost was still on the ground, glittering in the early light, and the air was cold and clear. I walked slowly toward the tree line, my heart in my throat, half expecting to see nothing, half expecting to see it again. But when I got to the spot where it had stood, I saw them, large partial footprints in the frost. They weren't like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were big, maybe 10 or 12 inches long, and shaped vaguely human but wider, with what looked like toes. The frost had melted in patches, so the prints weren't perfect, but you could see the impression of something heavy had been there. I didn't have a tape measure, so I used my boot for scale. My size 10 boot looked small next to them. I took a few photos with my phone, but they came out blurry because my hands were still shaking. I didn't follow the tracks into the woods. I was too scared to go any farther. I just stood there staring at them, and that's when it really hit me. This wasn't a dream or my imagination. Something had been there, something that shouldn't exist. I've lived in Colorado my whole life, and I've heard the stories about Bigfoot, but I always brushed them off as folklore or hoaxes. Now I'm not so sure. Since that day I've never seen it again, but I'm always on edge. I don't go out after dark anymore, and I keep the porch light on all night. The tree line that used to feel peaceful now feels menacing, like there's something hiding just beyond it, waiting. I've talked to a couple of neighbors, but they just laughed it off or said it was probably a bear. But I know what I saw, and those footprints, they're burned into my memory. I still have the photos on my phone, but I don't show them to anyone because I don't want to sound crazy. Writing this down is the first time I've really shared it, and it's hard to put into words how much it messed with me. That fear, that primal dread, it's still there, like a shadow I can't shake. Every time I look out at those trees, I remember those eyes, and I know, deep down, that something unnatural is out there, roaming these woods, and I have no explanation for it, none at all. Story 18. It was November of 2019, the tail end of the season. I'd been hunting these mountains in central Utah since I was a kid, the Manti La Sal. You get to know a place. You know the way the light hits a certain draw in the morning, the way the wind sounds different through the pines up high compared to the oak brush down low. It becomes a part of you. That morning, I was up and out of my truck while it was still full dark, the cold so sharp it felt like it was cleaning the inside of my lungs. My breath plumed in the beam of my headlamp as I hiked in. I had a specific spot in mind, a high ridge that overlooks a big, wide basin. It's a good place for glassing mule deer, especially early. They're down there feeding, moving from their beds to the shade as the sun gets higher. I made it to my perch just as the sky was starting to turn from black to that deep, bruised blue. I set up my tripod, got my binoculars out, and started the slow, methodical sweep. Left to right, near to far. It's a peaceful thing, that quiet focus. You're just looking for a flicker of movement, a shape that doesn't belong. The gray-brown of a deer against the gray-brown of the earth. The sun wasn't up yet, but the light was good enough to see shapes clearly. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a bear, a big one. It was maybe 300 yards away, on the opposite side of the basin, crawling on all fours over the crest of a rocky ridge. It was moving fast, way faster than any bear I'd ever seen. Its back was broad and powerful, covered in this dark, shaggy hair. But the way it moved, it was fluid, but also kind of awkward. Not like a bear's lumbering gait. This was different. I kept my glasses on it, my finger frozen on the focus wheel. My brain was trying to catch up, to file it into a category I understood. Big bear, a really big bear. Then it reached the top of the ridge, and it stood up. My breath just stopped in my throat. It wasn't a bear. It straightened its legs, its back, and it just kept going up and up until it was standing fully upright on 2 feet. It was massive. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing had to be close to 9 feet. It was silhouetted against the lightening sky, and the sheer size of it, the proportion, it was all wrong. It had these incredibly long, powerful-looking arms that hung down past its knees, and its shoulders were hunched and huge. Its head was kind of conical, like a dome that came to a point, and it seemed to sit directly on its shoulders without much of a neck. It just stood there for a few seconds, scanning the basin below. It turned its head slowly, and I swear I could feel the weight of that gaze even from across the distance. I was frozen solid, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack one. I was crouched down behind a low scrub oak, praying I was small, praying I was invisible. Then it started to walk. It took a few steps, those long, powerful strides eating up the ground. Its legs didn't swing like a man's. They moved with a purpose, a kind of heavy, deliberate grace. It didn't shuffle. It walked like it owned the earth beneath its feet. After a dozen steps or so, it dropped back down to all fours and scrambled over a patch of scree, moving with that same unnerving speed. Then it was up again, walking. It was alternating, like it was choosing the most efficient way to travel over the rough terrain. Crawl where it needed to, walk where it could. It was moving at an angle that would eventually bring it across my line of sight, and my fear was a live wire in my chest. I ducked my head down below the bush, pressing my face into the cold, gritty dirt. I could smell the sage and the dry earth. I could hear my own blood roaring in my ears. I had to look. I had to know where it was. I slowly, so slowly, raised my head, just enough to peer through the branches of the scrub oak. It had stopped. It was facing my direction. It was still a couple hundred yards away, but it was just standing there completely still. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon behind me, casting a weak orange light across the basin. That light hit the creature, and for the first time I wasn't just seeing a silhouette. I could see the color of its hair, a dark, wet-looking brown, almost black in the shadows. And I saw its face, or I saw where its face should be. It was shadowed, but I could make out the deep-set eyes. They weren't glowing or anything crazy like that. They were just dark pits. But in that moment, I knew. I knew with a cold, sick certainty that it was looking right at me. It had locked onto my position. It knew I was there. Time just stretched out. I didn't move. I don't think I even breathed. I was a statue, a part of the landscape, hoping it would just dismiss me as a rock or a stump. My fingers were digging into the dirt. My whole body tensed like a spring. The rifle leaning against the tripod next to me felt useless. A toy. What was I going to do? Shoot at it? The thought was absurd. Then it moved. It didn't charge. It didn't make a sound. It just turned its head away, looked back down into the basin, and then dropped back onto all fours. It crawled swiftly over the ridge and out of sight. I stayed there, crouched in the dirt, for what felt like an hour. My legs were cramping, my hands were numb from the cold and from gripping the ground so hard. The normal sounds of the forest started to trickle back in. A jay squawking somewhere, the whisper of the wind. But they sounded different now. They sounded like a cover for something else. I finally forced myself to move. My joints ached as I slowly, carefully stood up. I didn't even bother with my binoculars or my tripod. I just collapsed them, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the latches. I kept my eyes glued to the ridge where it had disappeared. Nothing, just empty, quiet forest. I was about to turn and make my way back down to get the hell out of there when the sound came. It wasn't a roar, it wasn't a scream, it was a grunt, a deep, guttural, chest-rattling grunt that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't loud in a deafening way, but it had a physical weight to it. I felt it in my sternum, a low-frequency thump that vibrated through the ground and up into my bones. It echoed through the canyon, bouncing off the rock walls, so you couldn't tell where it started or ended. It was a sound of pure, raw power. It was a sound that said, "I am here." That was it. That broke me. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I slung my rifle over my shoulder, grabbed my gear, and half ran, half stumbled down that mountain. I wasn't looking for deer. I wasn't looking at anything except the path in front of my feet. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the brush sent a fresh jolt of terror through me. I've never felt so exposed, so completely and utterly prey. I made it back to my truck, fumbled the keys, and got the hell out of there. I drove for 20 minutes before I even felt like I could pull over. I just sat on the side of the gravel road, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel, trying to process what I had just seen. I couldn't just leave it alone. The fear was there, a solid knot in my gut, but so was this burning, insane need for proof. I needed to know I wasn't crazy. The next day, I convinced a friend of mine to go back with me. I didn't tell him what I saw, just that I'd seen something weird and I wanted another set of eyes. He's a hunter too, a practical guy. I knew he'd think I was losing it if I told him the truth. We drove back up and hiked to the ridge where I'd seen it. The weather had held. No rain or snow to wipe anything away. We crossed the basin and started up the other side, towards the spot where it had stood and looked at me. My heart was in my throat the whole time. The place felt wrong. Quiet. The birds weren't singing. We found the spot. The ground was a mix of dirt and pine needles, and there, plain as day, were the footprints. They were huge, I mean just massive. My friend pulled out a tape measure from his pack, 15 inches long, with a wide ball and a narrower heel. They looked almost human, but not quite. The arch was flatter, the toes seemed splayed, and the stride length was incredible. You could see where it had been walking, each print spaced so far apart it would have been a running jump for me. And then we saw the other prints, the hand prints from when it was crawling. They were pressed into the dirt alongside the footprints in a few places. They were like a man's hand, but bigger, much bigger, with thick, blunt fingers. The sight of them, the clear evidence of something massive moving on all fours like that, made my skin crawl. But the worst part was the smell. It was faint, but it was there. A musky, heavy odor like wet dog and old, damp earth. It was the kind of smell that sits at the back of your throat. It was exactly what you'd imagine something that big and wild would smell like. My friend smelled it too. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, and his face had gone pale. He knew we weren't looking at a bear track. We didn't stay long. We took a few pictures, but they never do it justice. They just looked like blobs in the dirt. We got out of there. On the drive back, he finally asked me what I'd seen. I told him everything. He just listened, and when I was done, he nodded and said, "Yeah, that tracks." I never went back to that part of the forest to hunt. I tried, a few times in the following years, but the feeling was always there. That prickling on the back of my neck, the constant, low-grade feeling of being watched. The woods I'd loved my whole life felt different. They felt occupied. I'd lost my comfort there, the easy familiarity I'd always had. It was like finding out your own home has another room you never knew about, and something is living in it. What haunts me the most, even now, isn't just the size of it or the sound it made. It was the way it moved. It wasn't some clumsy monster. It was calculated. It scanned the terrain. It chose its gait. It knew I was there, and it made a decision to just leave. It was intelligent. It was purposeful, and that's a kind of fear that doesn't ever really go away. You just learn to live with the chill it leaves behind. Story 19. It was one of those November mornings that just felt wrong from the moment I opened my eyes. The air was too still, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like a blanket smothering everything. This was back in '93 on my family's farm. I'd been hunting these woods since I was a kid, knew every dip and gully, every old oak tree. But that day, the familiarity was gone. It was just off. I'd gotten to my ground blind well before first light. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old wooden frame my dad and I had built years ago, tucked into a thicket at the edge of a cornfield that had been harvested down to brittle golden stubble. The woods formed a dark wall on the other side of the field. My routine was always the same. Thermos of black coffee, my old 30-006 rifle, and the patience that comes from doing something 1,000 times. I settled in, the cold seeping up from the ground through the layers of my insulated pants. I remember the smell of damp earth and old wood, the faint metallic scent of the gun oil, normal things. The sun came up, a weak pale light that didn't do much to warm anything. For the first couple of hours it was just me and the crows arguing in the distance, the occasional scurry of a squirrel. I was watching the tree line, hoping to see a buck step out. My breath plumed in the air, and I'd sip my coffee, feeling the heat of it in my throat. It was boring the way hunting mostly is. You're just waiting. The first thing that was different was the silence. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow draining away of sound. The crows stopped. The squirrels vanished. It got so quiet I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. I remember shifting my weight, the crunch of a dry leaf under my boot sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. I figured maybe a fox had passed through, or the neighbor's dog was out roaming, something that would spook the small game. I didn't think much of it. Not then. Maybe 20 minutes later I heard the first sound that made my gut clench. It was behind me and to my left, back in the thicker woods where the pines grew close together. A single, heavy crunch. Not a twig snapping, but something bigger, a branch maybe. It was the kind of sound a large animal makes, a deer, or maybe a cow that had wandered out of the far pasture. I remember turning my head slowly, trying to peer through the tangle of brush behind the blind. I couldn't see anything but shadows and tree trunks. I settled back down, telling myself it was nothing, but the feeling was already there, a little knot of unease in my stomach. A few minutes passed, and then I heard it again. Another crunch, but this one was further to the right. It had moved. It had moved in a wide arc, from my left to further around my right side. That's when the first real trickle of fear went down my spine. A deer doesn't do that. A deer either freezes or bolts in a straight line. This thing was moving with a purpose, and the purpose seemed to be circling me. I held my breath, listening so hard my head started to ache. The wind picked up a little, a cold sigh through the pine needles, and that's when I smelled it. It hit me all at once, a wave of stink that made my eyes water. It's hard to describe, but I'll try. It was like a combination of things, like a wet dog, but 1,000 times stronger. Mixed with that was a sickening, sweetish smell, like rotten meat left out in the sun, and underneath it all, a foul, musky odor, like something that had been living in its own filth for years. It was overwhelming. I pressed the sleeve of my jacket against my nose, but it didn't help. The smell was everywhere. My heart was starting to hammer against my ribs now. Thump, thump, thump. So loud, I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I slowly, so slowly, it felt like my joints were rusted shut, turned my body in the blind to face the direction of the last sound. The blind was meant for looking out over the field, not for looking behind. I had to crane my neck, peering through a gap in the woven branches. I didn't see anything, just the same dark woods, but I could hear it moving. It wasn't walking like a person, and it wasn't walking like a bear. A bear has a kind of lumbering, heavy gait. This was different. It was a slow, deliberate, stealthy movement. I could hear the subtle compression of the forest floor, the soft rustle of something big brushing against low-hanging branches. It was still arcing around, getting closer to being directly behind me. And then came the worst part. The feeling of being watched. I've never felt anything like it before or since. It was a physical pressure on the back of my neck, a crawling sensation that made every hair on my body stand straight up. It was a primal, deep-down knowledge that something out there had its full, undivided attention on me. It wasn't just looking in my direction, it was studying me. I could feel its focus like a laser beam on the space between my shoulder blades. My skin was tingling, crawling with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the November chill. The sounds it made were all wrong. There was no rhythm to them. It would take 2 slow, careful steps, then pause for what felt like a full minute. Then there'd be a heavy, dragging sound, like it was pulling something. Then another step. It wasn't trying to be quiet anymore, I realized with a fresh jolt of terror. It was just moving. And its natural movement was that quiet, that controlled. The sheer size implied by that kind of quiet was staggering. This wasn't a 200-pound animal. This was something much, much bigger. My mind was racing, throwing up images of bears, of moose, of a stray bull. but none of them fit. A bull would have just charged or bellowed. A bear would have either run away or made more noise, huffing, breaking branches. A moose is tall and awkward, not stealthy. This was something that knew how to move through the woods without being seen. Something intelligent. I was frozen in place, my hand clenched so tightly around the rifle's stock that my knuckles were white. I was too scared to even lift it. What was I going to shoot at? A sound, a smell, the feeling of being watched? My breath was coming in short, ragged gasps, and I had to consciously force myself to breathe slower, quieter. The smell was still there, that god-awful stench, ebbing and flowing with the slight breeze, making my stomach turn. It moved again, and this time it was closer, much closer. I could hear the soft thump of its footfalls, each one a distinct, heavy impact on the ground. It was maybe 30, 40 yards behind the blind now. I could hear its breathing. It wasn't loud or panting. It was a low, deep, rhythmic sound, like a bellows pumping slowly. Each exhale was a deep, guttural rush of air. That sound, more than anything else, broke me. Animals don't breathe like that. Not any animal I'd ever heard. I knew, with a certainty that was absolute, that I could not stay in that blind. It was a trap. It had me cornered. Whatever was out there had maneuvered itself into a perfect position. I was facing the field, and it was behind me in the woods. If I tried to run for the woods, I'd be running right towards it. The only open, clear space was the field. The decision wasn't a thought. It was an instinct, a survival switch flipping in my head. I had to get out. Now, moving faster than I thought I could, I unzipped the flap of the blind. The sound of the zipper was obscenely loud. The movement in the woods stopped instantly. The breathing stopped. The silence that fell was even heavier, more terrifying than the sounds had been. It was listening. It was waiting. I didn't care anymore. I scrambled out of the blind, my boots slipping on the frosty leaves. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I looked back and saw it, I think I would have just dropped dead on the spot from pure fright. I backed away, my eyes locked on the tree line where I knew it was standing. My rifle was in my hands, but it felt as useless as a toy. I kept it pointed in the general direction, my finger on the trigger guard, not the trigger. My whole body was shaking so badly I couldn't have hit the broad side of a barn. I took one step back, then another. The corn stubble crackled under my heels. I was putting distance between me and the woods. 10 yards, 20. I was in the open now, completely exposed in the middle of this big, empty field. The pale sun was on my face. It should have felt safe, but it didn't. I felt like a target, and then, from the woods, directly from the spot I'd been staring at, came a sound I will hear until the day I die. It wasn't a growl, it wasn't a roar, it was a low, rumbling vibration, so deep I felt it in my bones more than I heard it with my ears. It was a hum that dropped into an impossibly deep, guttural groan, a sound of pure, raw power. It was a warning. It was a promise. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. That sound broke the last of my nerve. I turned and ran. I didn't care about being quiet, didn't care about looking tough. I ran like I was 10 years old and running from a nightmare. I ran across that field, my lungs burning with the cold air and panic, my legs pumping, expecting at any second to feel a massive hand clamped down on my shoulder, to be dragged back into those dark woods. I didn't stop until I reached the old barbed wire fence on the far side of the field. I scrambled under it, tearing my jacket, not even feeling it. I ran down the tractor path, past the equipment shed, and didn't stop until I was on the back porch of the farmhouse, slamming the door shut and locking it, my back against the solid wood, gasping for air. I never saw it. Not a shadow, not a shape, not a glint of an eye. I spent the rest of that day inside, jumping at every creak of the house. I went back the next day with my dad and my older brother, both of them armed. The ground around the blind was a mess. There were footprints, but they were so messed up from my own frantic scrambling that you couldn't make out a clear shape. But there was one print, about 15 feet back in the woods. It was huge, longer than my boot by a good 6 inches and twice as wide. It was pressed deep into the soft soil, a single clear impression. My dad, a lifelong farmer and hunter, just stared at it, his face pale. He looked at me, looked back at the print, and just shook his head. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. I never went back to that ground blind. I never hunted in those particular woods again. I've heard all the explanations. It was a bear, it was a moose, it was my imagination. I know what I felt, I know what I heard, I know what I smelled. That wasn't a bear, that wasn't anything from around here. That was something else, something old and smart and territorial. And on that cold November morning, for reasons I'll never understand, it decided to let me know I was in its world, not the other way around. I got the message. I still get chills thinking about that deep, rumbling groan. I didn't see a Bigfoot, but I know, with every fiber of my being, that it saw me.